Everyone, how are you doing? Credit to you all for being here despite a gorgeous day. You've made it here on time. Thank you very much. I also wanted to welcome 2 new members of the task force who are replacing other members from D1. We have Bob Levy.
Hello.
There he is. Hi, Bob. Welcome.
Hey, Bob.
And from Working Partnerships, we have Jeffrey Buchanan. Welcome, Jeffrey. I think that's the only new, right? New faces? Excellent. I wanted to just call your attention, and I know staff is going to go over this momentarily, call your attention to the new schedule, and I will just cue up Kulon.
Hi, thank you, co-chair. So in announcements, yes, we have the new task force update. Next meeting in March 26th, we'll have Coyote Valley and capacity shifts. Followed by April 30th, we'll have the Evergreen East Hills Development Policy and Transportation Policy, specifically vehicles miles traveled. And finally, on May 11th, we'll have summary and next steps. And Jared will have some updates as well.
And just note that previously we were scheduled on April 8th, so that is not on the schedule anymore. It's April 30th.
Also wanted to mention we've received some questions about recent state housing bills passed by the state legislature. We know that's kind of looming out there. The state's been particularly busy on legislature around housing. In regards to this, staff's going to be going to City Council in April of this year with an informational item that'll discuss some of the recent state legislation and the implication of those bills on San Jose's planning policy and ordinances. Additionally, want to mention that planning is also going to be giving a briefing to City Council in April on the upcoming regional housing needs allocation or RENA process that recently begun.
Yeah, those are both really big issues that have been looming out there. I know, it feels like it's a bit of a huge elephant in the room. And so I asked staff to just touch on those quickly. And we will continue with the scope that the council set for us, recognizing that there are some big changes that are looming on the horizon. Anything you want to add, Michael? And then I saw you, Leslie.
I could or could not. I think just the thing to be aware of, I think some of you are tracking this, is that the RENA number for the Bay Area is probably going to be at least a 3-fold increase from last time, is my guess. If I had to bet, I would bet on that, because Los Angeles received more than 3 times their allocation, or the Southern California Association of Governments received more than 3 times their housing allocation in the previous RENA cycle. And given that I would argue the Bay Area, the housing crisis is much worse in the Bay Area than Los Angeles, where I'm from, that we'll at least get a 3-fold increase in the Bay Area. So that has significant implications down the road for our work on updating our housing element, which we need to do. Our housing element is one of our elements in our general plan, and we need to complete that by the end of 2022.
Leslie, I saw your hand up. Can someone get Leslie a microphone? Cool. I know you've been sick, so you don't want to shout.
I just wanted to get the dates again. Those 2 things are coming forward.
Oh.
We're still finalizing the dates. They will be in April, and we can certainly notify the task force once those are agendized.
And we anticipate the state will provide a bag with the Bay Area's housing number, and in the spring, I've heard April, but it could be later in the spring.
Thank you, staff. So with regard to our agenda tonight, I just wanted to comment that, we really want to stick to the times noted on the agenda. That means that we will go up until 6:40 to the items 1, 2, and 3, and then up to 7:50 p.m. on item 4, and closing out at 9 p.m. on opportunity housing. I'm going to really try to stick to those times if we can. Staff, please.
So yes, there are 3 topics to vote on tonight, but before that, we're going to recap on the motion that happened at the last task force meeting. So at the January 30th meeting, the first thing the task force did was recommended elimination of urban village horizons. And second, for policy IP 2.10, the task force accepted the task force accepted staff language for urban village planning prioritization with a clarification to change and to or. And the text is on the slide itself as well as in your packet. Third is the motion on the signature project policy, community engagement. The task force has approved staff recommendation for that language and is on the screen. And the next for signature project policy, the affordable housing incentives, the reduction of commercial requirements. So the task force have approved the motion that's on the screen. First, to reduce or eliminate of commercial requirements as an incentive for affordable housing for signature projects and in all urban villages. So it's for staff to look at that. Second, to use the methodology in option 1 the staff has given as a basis without adopting the percentage ratio between building affordable housing and reduction in commercial requirements. The particular percentages will be subject to a feasibility analysis. Third, in the feasibility analysis staff would do before going to City Council, it will include coordination with stakeholders such as affordable housing developers. And as well, it would consider the letters from the task force with any alternative options to look at square footages versus percentages. And fourth, the recommendation should be expedited to City Council.
Great. Thank you so much, staff. Really appreciate you recapping those.
You're welcome.
You want to move on? Yeah.
Next is the IP 5.12, 100% affordable housing. So the task force accepted staff changes to this policy as shown above, with the change of removing the commercial requirement for 100% affordable housing. For staff to follow up at the next meeting, we'll explore flexible commercial requirements for affordable housing citywide, and this will presented at the March 26th task force meeting. So that ends the recap, and Robert Rivera will present on the next topic.
Thank you.
Good evening, task force members. Robert Rivera with the general plan team. I'll be presenting on the Capital Caltrain station area. Briefly, I just want to go over how this area was analyzed, and the Monterey Corridor Working Group helped it analyze the area. The Monterey Corridor Working Group, led by Council Member Maya Esparza and Sergio Jimenez, began their work in May of 2019. And it's composed of Monterey Corridor stakeholders being business owners, residents. They've had meetings with the Caltrain and various stakeholders, Granite Rock, to discuss different items to beautify and promote economic development and develop a working plan for the Monterey Corridor, and what they envision in about 2 years. To advance these goals, they've recommended to create a new regional transit urban village around the Capital Caltrain station. And this was analyzed for mixed-use development. It's currently an employment area. And one of the main reasons this area was identified was the Caltrain 2040 service vision, plans for significant increase in service and frequency along the Caltrain station. And the Monterey Corridor Working Group's recommendation was to create a new urban village around the Capital Caltrain station. So staff's recommendation is consistent with the working group's recommendation to establish a Capital Caltrain station area by converting the West Capitol Expressway Monterey Road employment area, revising the boundaries to exclude multifamily residential neighborhood that most likely won't get redeveloped. The new area would be about 16 acres, and it would have a capacity of 700 residential units and 100 jobs. here's a map of, in blue is the employment area, and the hash marks represent the new Capital Caltrain station boundaries. The multifamily in the darker orange was excluded, again, because of the likelihood of redevelopment. That concludes staff's recommendation.
Yeah,
You guys want to comment?
I will.
Okay,
That was a quick presentation. Thank you so much. Task force discussion. Andre, I hear you're, here we go. I see him. Andre? Oh, there we go.
Hi. Question for staff. Why is the residential neighborhood, maybe they can explain further why the residential neighborhood is excluded? Because in many of the other urban village zones, a half mile from the transit-oriented or the transit corridor is allowed for redevelopment as part of an urban village, and it seems like we ought to maximize the amount of opportunity around that Caltrain station. So I guess I'd like to understand more about at least a half mile, why we couldn't do a half mile on the east side of Monterey Road. And then I think similar to one of the other task force members' recommendations, we also ought to be looking on the west side of the Caltrain corridor for future development. And then lastly, I have a question about Blossom Hill as being also a potential urban village.
When looking at the boundary for the proposed Capital Caltrain station area, we want to respect the interface with residential, single-family residential neighborhood, being all the northwest portion. And on the opposite side of Monterey Road, the granite rock is on the opposite side of the Capital Caltrain station area, and we wanted to preserve the interface between industrial uses and high-density residential.
I'd add to the area that's currently within the employment area, where you'll see the boundaries in blue, that has existing multifamily. I think there's, some concern there by including it in the urban village for potential mixed use residential uses, that there's issues with displacement there. Some of those apartments could be rent controlled given the age of those buildings. So that's something we considered. And they're, compared to the rest of the properties in the boundary, they're basically fully developed versus the other properties where you have a vacant parking lot where the park and ride station currently is, or the parking lot. Regarding the west side, so this area is already part of the Communications Hill specific plan growth area. So it's planned for within that specific plan. It has a industrial designation, and currently has, as Robert mentioned, it's occupied by Granite Rock, who's also looking at expanding their operations there. They have a proposal in with the city to do that. And then there's various other industrial businesses that occupy those sites along Hillcap Avenue in terms of manufacturing and auto-related businesses. The specific plan itself actually strategically planned for housing away from the industrial uses there. At the southern base of Communications Hill, there's an entitlement for 1.4 million square feet of industrial area or industrial uses that would be adjacent to the current industrial uses along Hillcap Ave and Granite Rock Way, and then the residential uses more towards the bottom of Communications Hill were planned to be more on the northeast side away from the industrial uses. So that's some of the reason in terms of coming west from Monterey Road. Oh, I also want to mention that there's a pretty big split in terms, you have Monterey Road, and then you have the Caltrain corridor now that's also going to be occupied by high-speed rail. So in terms of connectivity between the two sides, there's kind of a big divide there. There'll be a big barrier between what's already there and then what's to come.
Just a follow-up question, though. What I don't understand is, you mentioned something about respecting the adjacent neighborhoods, residential neighborhoods, but other urban village corridors within a half mile of urban village, you don't talk about respecting those residential neighborhoods, and it just doesn't seems like, depending on what project you're talking about or what urban village, you may or may not want to apply the same standard. So like I said, I don't understand why this half mile, why this residential neighborhood has to be specifically excluded.
So generally with urban villages, the general rule is that the urban village boundaries are defined by the commercial properties on the given corridor or arterial, and the single-family homes are not included in the boundary. There are some cases where some homes or some portions of a neighborhood have been included, and they are, what the plans generally do is dedicate them for preservation. So it's not that it couldn't be considered to expand the boundary into the neighborhood. I think we are keeping with past practice of respecting that neighborhood. There could be opportunities for infill, which we're going to talk about on the next agenda item coming up, opportunity housing. But for the purpose of the urban village planning, we're keeping with that spirit of focusing the higher intensity development on the corridor, on commercial properties, and not encroaching upon existing single-family neighborhoods.
Thank you, staff. On this side, Jesse, Kevin, and Sean.
Real quickly, I just wanted to understand the capacity recommendation of 700 units. And your recommendations for Story Road, you're suggesting 1,000 units.
Oh.
Can you discuss the difference and why there's a different suggestion on capacity there?
Sure, a lot of it comes down to size. This one's it's 16 acres. We took a look at the parcels on this and did some analysis and assumptions on what could potentially be developed on these sites. That's how we derived 700 for this particular urban village. Story Road, which we'll talk about a little later, much larger village in terms of acreage, and the opportunity sites there are quite a bit larger, particularly on the edges, on the west and east ends of the village. And the 1,000 units are pretty typical of the local transit urban villages that we have in the general plan. So we're taking a look at that as well.
Great. Kevin?
Thanks. I just wanted to see if you can explain a little bit more about the decision not to include anything on the west side of Monterey Road. I mean, I understand the industrial site up to the north and, but there's more land than just industrial right in there. You have that, cul-de-sac in, you have that, the site to the south, maybe there's small parcels. It just seems like a missed opportunity to be that close walking to a capital Caltrain and focusing development there to not try to get another few hundred units of capacity or square feet out of it.
So are you referring to the northwest quadrant of Capitol and Monterey?
Okay. Capital and Monterey, northwest.
Yeah, so I think in some is that's industrial parkland, which is, so our employment land overall in the city is about 15% of our total land. And industrial, I can't remember the exact figure, it's probably 2% of the land in the city. So it has some of the lowest vacancy rates of any land in the city, and it's really critical that the general plan about preserving that type of land for uses that provide good paying jobs for people that don't have college degrees, that provide a diversity of employment and support a lot of our driving industry. So that area is within the, much of it's, I think all of it, or much of it's within the communications specific plan, all of it is. And so the concept there is to grow the housing and another portion of the specific plan and reserve this for employment type uses.
Great.
to mention too, again, there's multiple existing industrial businesses there currently operating, and it's kind of a collection of industrial uses there. So by introducing residential onto this side, then there's immediately impacts to those uses in terms of, even in our zoning code, in terms of noise, setbacks, and things that they can do, and so that's something we, especially given the collection of businesses there along Hillcap and Granite Rock Way, that's a particular area that we'd want to preserve for those important uses. And again, Granite Rock is also looking at expanding their uses there and doing some improvements on the site.
Thank you. Sean?
Yeah, I don't want to take up too much time. I'm going to vote to support staff recommendation, but I hope as a task force that we can start thinking bigger about our transit infrastructure and our housing. I put this together on Google Earth, and if you really look at this, this could be really a 100-acre transit village. And I guarantee you that you're going to generate more temporary and full-time jobs building 10,000 housing units with supporting commercial uses on this than you are from the existing industrial uses. And I did talk to Eric Schoenhauer before the meeting. Granite Rock is not opposed to having residential next to the site. So I just wanted to inform the task force about that. And I think there's a way to work with city staff on adding employment capacity to these types of areas, but having a Caltrain stop that we're not building at densities to support ridership just doesn't make sense to me going forward, and I just thought I'd share that.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Important comment. Would you like to comment now?
Yeah.
And then Sam.
I just wanted to follow up on Andre's question. He had sent a letter about potential for doing urban villages in the vicinity of the Blossom Hill Caltrain station. What villages do we have in that vicinity right now?
So there are some villages along Blossom. There's one at the Blossom Hill Light Rail Station. In the Chenoweth and Monterey. There's a urban village there as well. Well, was there a particular location that you were thinking for a new urban
Well,
village?
by the Caltrain station, I mean, if we're looking at Capital Express, or, the Capital Caltrain station as being an urban village, we ought to also be looking at the Blossom Hill Caltrain station.
Yeah, isn't that where the Walmart used to be?
There's all kinds of, there's the new Lowe's that's been built, but there's also a lot of.
Oh, I know what you're talking about. That is actually technically an urban village now. That's the iStar, Hitachi, IBM urban village area.
But is it on the west side of?
It's on the west side of the track.
Because there's also lots of surface parking lots and underutilized lands on the east side of Monterey Road.
I mean, that's something we can definitely look at. We can't speak to that off the top of our head, but yeah, we can look at that.
Sam?
Thank you for the presentation. I just want some clarification or elaboration on 100 jobs. How did we arrive at that number, and what types of jobs? Can you elaborate a little more on that?
Yeah, so that just carries forward the current number of jobs allocated to this employment area, because currently now, as Robert was saying, it's currently an employment area. There's no planned housing growth allocated to this within that boundary. So we just kept the jobs as they are today in the general plan. We weren't proposing any changes there in terms of planned new jobs. And the jobs could be, the general plan's agnostic about the types of jobs that those would be.
Great. Is there any public comment on this item? Any member of the public that wants to speak on this issue? Great. We will entertain a motion if anyone wants to put a motion to. Oh, did you have another comment, Andre? I thought your card was still
No,
up
one
from
other quick
prior.
question.
Sorry.
So why couldn't we try to establish a larger employment or jobs target for that area? I mean, if we're trying to reduce vehicle miles traveled, why not put jobs and residential next to the Caltrain station?
Yeah, that, good question. Yeah, and we could, I think, we just felt we would, you know, there's already an allocation of jobs there, so we would leave that as is. There's, as I mentioned, so across Monterey Road is part of the Communications Hill specific plan and the entitlements on Communications Hill. It's north of the Granite Rock site that you see on the side, just north of the Capitol Caltrain station. There's entitlement for 1.4 million square feet of industrial uses. So there is quite a bit of employment uses planned in this area currently.
And I should add, I think it's the next task force meeting, but we'll be digging a lot more into detail about the distribution of jobs and housing to explain sort of why there's, but in general, well, we'll hold off on that, but we'll get into this detail. I think when we get into that sort of a globally, and the whole city will kind of understand the bigger picture and why we might have put 100 jobs here versus 1,000. That will help.
Thank you. Councilmember Foley.
I'll move the staff recommendation.
Councilmember Davis. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? One opposed. Any abstentions? One abstention. Thank you very much. Okay, let's move on to the next topic, residential uses in neighborhood business districts. Who's presenting that, staff? Kulon. Great, you're on.
Yeah, we're gonna start.
So the City Council's approved scope of work is to explore policies that will allow limited housing in neighborhood business districts and determine shifts in planned housing capacity to facilitate future residential development in those areas. So a neighborhood business district, or NBD, provides a sense of place and identity for the local community. The businesses within a typical NBD reflects the character and culture and adds to the vitality of the neighborhood. An NBD provides an opportunity for local employment, and findings have shown that small family-owned or independent businesses average between 10 to about 22 years in some of the NBDs. As defined by the general plan, an NBD is a designation that applies to commercial areas that functions in their communities as local or neighborhood-serving business districts, providing community focus and identity through the delivery of goods and services. The NBD designation, The NBD designation functions as an overlay in the general plan, and typically there are two types of commercial areas under this designation. So as shown on the left, Willow Street, or Calle Willow, as it's locally called, these older commercial areas have connected buildings to create a predominant pattern of continuous street facade with no or very little setbacks from the sidewalk. And on the right, the Story Road NBD typically is more auto-oriented and characterized by buildings set in the rear and parking towards the street frontage. So of the 10 neighborhood business districts throughout the city, 5 are already located within urban villages or growth areas, which allows for residential uses based on the adopted urban village plan. And of course, in an urban village area without an adopted plan, resident uses, as you heard previously, are allowed through the signature project policy, as well as policy IP 5.12, the 100% affordable housing, or through the underlying general plan designation that already allows for residential uses. Because 5 of the NBDs are already urban villages, staff proposed that we focus this policy work to narrow to the ones outside of the urban villages. These are Willow Street, or Calle Willow, North 13th Street, also locally known as Luna Park, Willow Glen, Japantown, and Story Road. So those are highlighted in the map in the slide in yellow. And while Story Road NBD fits the criteria, staff will discuss this as a potential for an urban village later in the presentation. So before we dive into 5 NBDs and the characteristics, staff want to lay out the policy recommendation that will facilitate housing in these areas. So first is to establish Willow Street, North 13th Street, Willow Glen, and Japantown, the Taylor Street portion, as growth areas. Second is to establish an initial pool of 600 residential units as the capacity. Then to revise the MBD overlay in the general plan to provide flexibility in housing. So in this, staff want to create certain criteria, so include residential development, but then the residential development should not adversely impact the viability of the surrounding commercial businesses, because these are commercial business districts and the intent is for commercial uses first. The new development should complement the scale and density of the existing urban fabric. So that's building types, thoroughfares, open space, frontages, streetscapes within the MBDs, as well as comply to the citywide design guidelines. And lastly, the identified historic structures to be adaptively reused into the new development on site. And the last recommendation on this topic is to establish the Story Road Employment Lands Growth Area as a local transit urban village. The Willow Street Calle Willow Neighborhood Business District is a corridor on Willow Street between McLeland Avenue and Alberton Avenue. It is an established Latino district with Spanish-speaking businesses located on both sides of Willow Street. The district is approximately 15 acres and 0.42 miles long. There are lots averaging approximately the size of large single-family residence, about 6,500 square feet. So most properties in the MBD, as shown on the image, is mixed-use commercial general plan designation. This requires a commercial component of at least 0.5 floor area ratio for any mixed-use residential project. So the mixed-use commercial designation, or MUC for short, allows for a variety of medium-scale commercial uses, from neighborhood retail, offices, and healthcare facilities. The residential density is up to 50 dwelling units per acre. For a residential mixed-use commercial project, commercial minimum is 0.5 FAR and can be up to 4.5 FAR. For commercial-only project, the minimum floor area ratio is 0.25. So as shown in the photos, commercial buildings on Willow Street are connected or have very little setback from each other and creates a continuous street facade. The buildings have very little or no setback from the sidewalk. Parking lots and typically street parking are placed in the rear and access via long driveways or alleys. Buildings and businesses are defined by vibrant colors and or signages. Here, bus route number 25 provides local service every 12 to 15 minutes on weekdays. And the western portion of this neighborhood business district is approximately half a mile from the Tamian Transit Station. The North 13th Street NBD is located on both sides of 13th Street, between East Heading and Jackson Street, anchored by Bakesto Park. The NBD is little over 20 acres, about half a mile long, and comprised of small lots averaging a parcel size of 0.2 acres, or about 8,700 square feet. Similar to Willow Street or Calle Willow, properties in this NBD have a mixed-use commercial designation. The 13th Street Business Corridor was established in the first half of the 20th century by Italian immigrants who built small multi-family houses and stores with areas for their families to live above. The commercial buildings vary with either multiple buildings flush towards the sidewalks or buildings set to the rear with parkings towards the street frontage. Along with retail and restaurant businesses, there are hotels, automotive shops, and gas stations in this district. There are also bike lanes along the corridor. The Willow Glen Neighborhood Business District is 0.73 miles long, a corridor along Lincoln Avenue between Coe Avenue to the north and Minnesota Avenue to the south. It is approximately 45 acres with an average lot of 0.3 acres or 13,000 square feet. Currently, all properties within the NBD are designated neighborhood community commercial, showing the pink on the map, and that does not allow residential development. The neighborhood community commercial designation allows for a broad range of commercial uses, neighborhood serving retail stores and services, commercial and professional offices, private community gathering facilities. New developments should support walking, transit use, and public interaction. And then once again, new residential uses are not allowed. So Willow Glen is a very vibrant, successful, and pedestrian-oriented neighborhood business district with retail, restaurants, and other community-serving businesses. The pedestrian-friendly streetscape includes street trees, bike lanes, special paving crosswalks, seatings, planters, and lighting. The district is served by bus routes 64 and 82, typically a 30-minute headway on each route on weekdays. The Japantown MBD is 40.6 acres, located north of downtown and roughly bound by Taylor Street and North 7th Street, East Empire Street, and 2nd Street. Japantown is eligible to be a National Historic Landmark District and is one of the 3 last historic Japantowns in the U.S. The Japantown MBD overlaps the Jackson-Taylor residential area east of North 6th Street. The residential strategy area already has a residential capacity, and over 700 residential units have been built in the specific plan areas in adoption of the general plan. Considering the historic and cultural sensitivity of Japantown and its overlay with the Jackson-Taylor residential strategy, staff recommends that policy changes applies to only the section of Taylor Street within the Japantown MBD. So that's hashtag in the red in the map. So this area is bound by North 2nd Street to the west and North 6th Street to the east. This sub-area averaged a lot size of 0.2 acres or 8,700 square feet. Additionally, VTA bus line number 61 runs through Japantown MBD along Taylor Street and provide a local service every 12 to 15 minutes on weekdays. So Japantown along Taylor Street ranges in a variety of commercial and residential uses, as well as building heights as shown in the images, from a 1-story medical office on the left to a 6-story residential tower on the right. So staff want to show examples of the type of building forms that could happen within MBDs when you put residential and mixed use in. So shown here on the slide are concepts from the 13th Street Neighborhood AARP report. The concept shows variation of 2 to 3-story buildings, as well as public plazas and open spaces. And the next images, these are locally residential mixed-use areas. On the bottom are 4-story, and they're actually in San Jose. The upper right is actually kind of a corner 2 to 3 commercial and plaza that's actually in the Willow Glen NBD. On the left, it shows a variety, I think more in the Berkeley area of showing the concept of office and residential and commercial on the bottom. And the far right, an actual step up to a 5-story tower. So these are staff recommendation once again. And staff also have recommended changes to the MBD overlay, which is in your packet. It should be on page 4. So staff is not recommending this time the actual maximum residential or height limits. That will be actually a further analysis.
Great. All right, any questions for staff? I see Sean, I see Councilmember Foley. I see several, actually, over there. Let's start with you, Sean. Oh, sorry, is there more? Oh, I apologize.
Wait. Chris Burton, Deputy Director with the Office of Economic Development. I'm joined by
yes.
Victor Farley, who's one of our business development
Thank you.
officers, who's also the lead for our small business displacement program
Thanks.
currently. And we wanted to give you just a quick update on some of the work that we're doing around the neighborhood business districts. You'll see us often more with the larger employment conversations. We'll be back for the next task force meeting for that conversation. But we wanted to reassure you today of the importance of our neighborhood business districts to our economic strategy. The neighborhood business districts are fascinating places, and they're really defined by their overarching characteristic, which is their connection to place, right? They are neighborhood in nature and in scale. And so they represent a mix and a diverse mix of uses that support the local area around them and also the local populace. You'll see that most of the businesses within our NBDs are either run by or owned by local residents. They're serving the local community. So it serves an important function, both as an amenity to those residents, but also as an opportunity, right? It provides employment to folks that may not be able to get employment in other industries that we see in our major growth areas. What we've seen most recently, as Kulon pointed out, because of the nature of change, within the general plan, we've seen some conversions of neighborhood business districts into urban villages. And that's had some impacts, especially around small business displacement. So we wanted to give you an update on the work that we're currently doing around small business displacement with a focus on Alum Rock, just to give you that additional context. And with that, I'll hand it to Vic.
Thank you very much, Chris. Good evening, everyone. I will be providing you with a very short presentation, which you have in front of you, that gives you an understanding and update of the city's approach, as Chris mentioned. Essentially, what is displacement? You can reduce the book of 1,000 pages to 2 words. It's involuntary relocation, and the key word there is involuntary. How this impacts on business varies according to the business, and what we've witnessed here is the outcome can be extreme risk for certain types of businesses. The most particular here that's relevant to a neighborhood would be a restaurant. The capital cost of relocation is significant, and the opportunity to move from A to B within a planned timescale can be extremely difficult to the point of impossible. So this is a relevant issue, both affecting Alum Rock, as I'll come on to explain, but many other neighborhoods across the city which we've experienced and witnessed over the course of the last 12 months. We have three types of triggers for business displacement. The detail, if you're interested in looking at this, was set out in the council study session that was held on October 1st, 2019. Direct displacement, which is relevant to specific site redevelopment. Indirect displacement, which we witness when rents and rising occupancy costs are passed on to the tenant or the leaseholder to the point where the business either cannot sustain that rent increase, either by virtue of putting up prices or reducing costs. And generally, land scarcity is driving up prices, and we begin to see that particularly on the east side of the city, as I'll come on to explain shortly. Why is this an issue in California, as distinct from other states? Well, there are no commercial rent control or specific tenant protections for commercial businesses. There's no Ellis Act equivalent. There's no statutory compensation for relocation outside of the lease terms, so whatever is in the lease is fundamental to the outcome. And in some instances, there is no lease. It's by word of mouth. Unlike residential issues, there's no warranty of habitability. It is what it is in front of you. It's caveat emptor, buyer beware, in terms of how a landlord and a tenant approach the negotiation and reach agreement. And more recently, in relation to tax-funded projects, and this is relevant in the context of affordable housing, compensation is capped. And when you look at the regulation in detail, you'll notice that the cap is set at $31,000, and that figure was set in 1994, and it's a standard sum applicable to any business in California. So you could be in Modesto or San Jose, and it's the same number. It takes no account of the cost of living or the cost of relocation. It is what it is within the California state regulations. Why is this an issue in San Jose? As Chris has already mentioned, small businesses do reinforce a positive neighborhood identity. 60% of small business owners, we estimate, are people of color. Most small businesses lease, not own premises. That, in a sense, exposes the risk. If most small businesses owned the premises they were in, they would have more control over their lives, livelihoods, and decision-making. And to bring this to the point of this evening, once commercial land is lost, typically it's lost forever. And the city has an overall jobs deficit. as Michael has mentioned earlier, you'll be receiving a future paper on jobs, but jobs in the broadest sense need to accommodate all the needs of the residents of the city rather than just one particular focus or part of that market, and therefore neighbourhoods have a particular relevance. Why Alum Rock? Well, this map summarises everything. This is both short-term and long-term. Within Alum Rock, along the pilot of the Alum Rock Avenue, you have the impact of the planned BART Phase 2, which is a 10-year project with the station at 5 Wounds, now known as Little Portugal. We have the urban villages. We have affordable housing projects. And in a sense, it's not just short-term change, but long-term change. So to assess the impact of how we should approach small business development, that's why we targeted the area in Alum Rock to support the businesses. We identified over 200 businesses within that area, employing close to 500 people across a wide range of different types of businesses. And a key point that came out from our data was that on average, businesses have been there 10 years or more. How the city is responding, essentially this is my role within the Office of Economic Development, to be a single point of access. I'm kind of the human point of information, both being proactive locally within Alum Rock and also internally informing colleagues in different departments. Collaboration is a key word in the pilot, and in particular with the local business association in Alum Rock. And within that, we begin to look for early notification of development. A key point here for business is the longer time you have to react to the prospect of being relocated, the more time you have to consider the options, the more likely you are to survive the outcome. When people are on 30 days notice, it's very difficult to make the best decisions. And we have experience of individual businesses that have been subject to that. We've established a rapid response of particular business providers who want to work in the area, and I've established a network with banks. We have 24 retail banks in the city who are all competitive and wish to access capital for small businesses with the usual caveat and proviso of the criteria that banks use to lend. But fundamentally, the east side of the city has been undercapitalized on the basis of SBA-approved loans over many years. So it's a way in which the city can bring to bear institutional partners to support small business. Next steps, just to summarize where we are, we'll be reviewing the progress of the pilot in the summer. We're considering a design on how to roll out, and we'll be working to see how we propose to scale out the services. I'll conclude by saying that, in summary, there's a powerful connection between successful small businesses and successful neighborhoods. One goes in hand with the other. It's very difficult to have a successful neighborhood without successful business. Placemaking, identity, and quality of life are the critical building blocks of many neighborhoods, not just in the neighborhoods you're witnessing and seeing and discussing this evening, but across the city as a whole. And that's why small business is one of the building blocks of the city's success. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vic and Chris. So let me tell you who I have written down, and please tell me if I'm incorrect. I see either Smita or Juan. Is it Smita? And then Luis, Sean, I'm coming this way. Shiloh, Michael, Pam, Harvey, Ray. I see you in there. Oh, now others are popping up. Okay, let's start down here. It was Smita.
Okay, I want to say thank you for the presentation. I put my card up to ask exactly the question you answered, so I'm going to change my question to a comment and just say that I very much appreciate the attention you're giving to this issue and that it is a very important concern as we move forward, as we try to prioritize housing to make sure that existing small businesses that have made our community what it is and given so many of us a chance to live here and thrive here do not get pushed out or displaced. So thank you.
Thank you. Luis, is that you or? No? Okay. Oh, it's not up? Okay. Then Sean. Thanks.
Appreciate staff supporting housing and neighborhood business districts. I'd like to better understand how you think about density in these districts, because I want to give you a real-world example of an urban village project that we have across from Santana Row. And it's really the unintended consequence of thinking of density in terms of units versus looking at the form of a building and how the same building could house more people. So for example, our project at Olin and Winchester is limited to 65 feet. It's about a half an acre, and I'm limited at 50 DUs to the acre. So I end up with 27 1,600 square foot units. Okay, so these units, in order for me to make the project pencil, I've got to sell them for about $1.8 million plus. I could fit 54 800 square foot units and sell them for a lot less. But I'm precluded from doing that in the urban village. So when you guys look at setting the densities for these neighborhood business districts, maybe think about the form of the building rather than density maximums. Because it creates some real world problems for affordability and for developers who need velocity on projects.
Sure.
Yeah, so I think we generally agree with you. I think we haven't dialed in that sort of the scale, but we're kind of generally thinking in a 3 to 4 story range. Taylor would be higher because it's a major street. That's something we're going to do some more outreach with to kind of dial that in, but we generally agree with you. I think one of the things that has come up is that San Jose very much gives density away because we want density, and I think that's not a bad thing, but one of the unintended consequences of that is that we have a thing called density bonus law where a developer can get more height and more density if they include some affordable housing units. And there isn't an incentive to do that because the densities we set are so high. So we sort of have to kind of balance those two things in coming up with the right density. But in general, we sort of agree it's going to be more about the box and less about the density within that box.
Thank you. Ray?
Thank you, staff, for the presentation. A question. I notice on part 2 of the staff recommendation, we're talking about a reallocation of 600 residential units from existing urban villages to the neighborhood business districts. And I guess my question is, and maybe Michael, you brought it up, the upcoming RENA cycle, we're going to see an increase in demand for residential across the city. It seems like this is an opportunity to add residential as opposed to just reallocating. What was the decision-making behind that?
So allocating more housing growth beyond the 120,000 units that we have in our general plan is a much heavier lift. It is outside of the scope of this process, but putting that aside, it requires a new EIR. So that could be something that happens as part of our housing element update over the next 2.5, 3 years. That's possible, that could happen, but not part of this 4-year process.
Yeah. So we're close, but not close enough. Shiloh?
2 comments, I think. One is, thank you for the presentation on the displacement work that you guys are doing, or I'm not sure what the correct terminology is. I was a little confused of like what it is exactly. What is the pilot? You talked about a network of banks or whatever, but I wasn't clear on, so what happens? What is it that you're providing? And then my second comment is, I'm very supportive of adding housing to the neighborhood business districts, and this speaks to what I was just speaking to, and I think what you've heard, because it's clear that folks have expressed reservation about, well, what happens to the character and the folks who already are doing business there, and the future, the ability of folks in the future to start mom and pop businesses in these areas. So it sounds like that you guys already felt it, or we said it and you heard it. So I see like Calle Willow up there, and I get scared that is a cultural asset for this city. And although I really want to see housing there, I get really scared about what that means for a street like that in terms of just everything that goes on. Like, that's scary. So anyway.
I think the practical answer in relation to banks is we work collaboratively with the Small Business Administration, the federal agency, and we hosted at the Mexican Heritage Plaza with the regional director, and every bank came to that in the city, and from that we established contacts with each of the key managers in the city, and then I personally either have a relationship with each of them or I direct them to the Alum Rock Business Association. And then we have worked with the Alum Rock Business Association to host localized events which they run where they have topics, and one of the key topics they've been running is access to capital. So we're trying to facilitate and collaborate at both ends, both with the institutions as well as the organisations locally. But the philosophy very much within that is to enable the business and the business groups within Alum Rock to define that agenda for themselves. We don't set that, but we want to facilitate it. And then the other two things we do is we work closely with the technical assistance providers, those organisations that are funded, again, federally through the state to support small business. And I work with each of them individually as organisations to refer them to businesses in Alum Rock. And so that's the components of the pilot. And then we set the geography, but within the terms of the geography, if anyone in Alum Rock were to contact me, I would see them. So we don't use the geography as a barrier. We use that really as a focus and a focal point. And in the context of what's happening in, say, for instance, with relation to BART Phase 2, we've been very outgoing in saying to VTA on the need for a business stakeholder group to engage all the businesses along the line of the route, including Alum Rock, Little Portugal, to ensure that the business owners are engaged in the issues of pre-construction and construction. So they're bringing together these various elements. And we're going to be quite honest, I think, and reflect on what works and what doesn't work when we get to the summer, and then report across the council on that basis.
Vic, you said something to me when we were talking about this that had a big impact on me, and that is that a lot of these business owners aren't even aware of what's going on, and all of a sudden they find out they have 30 days to get out, and if you have 30 days to get out, you're pretty much done. And so a lot of it, I think, is what you were saying, is just we are aware of what's going on and just reaching out to businesses and letting them know. I don't want to steal your thunder, but hey, there's some plans afoot. Have you thought about plans of what could you relocate? Do you want to? Could we help you? Could we connect you to resources? So I think just that connection is really important.
Michael?
A question and then a comment. The question has to do with the 100% replacement of the commercial industrial space. Is that just a kind of a basic form going in as you study this? Is it going to be a case by case? Because while some business districts are more flourishing, others are not. And the uses have, with all due respect to small businesses, they've outlived their purpose in the district, and that's why the business districts are suffering. So what's the rationale behind 100% replacement, which I'll get in my comment after the answer.
So I would say for the most part, these districts are thriving. They're not underutilized. So I would differ in that. I think the idea is, one is we have to be very objective per the state rules now. So you can't say substantially or kind of do this. You need to say exactly what you need to do per state law. And so, again, I think the focus of these business districts is we want to enhance and preserve them for existing and future businesses. And so kind of keeping that space and that commercial focus while allowing the introduction of other residential. So while we could have had a flexible policy, the state law kind of precludes us from doing that. And we think it's important to maintain the amount of commercial that's in the district now. We really don't anticipate these being places where we get a lot significantly more commercial. I think it's more about supporting and enhancing what's there now.
Great.
Chance for comments later.
No, go ahead.
Again, this is just, it's deja vu. It's the same thing over and over, the idealism. It's not feasible so we need some type of space to create, 600 units. If you think about it spread out, that's actually could be 100-unit projects in each of these districts, which is good density, which is going to provide affordable housing. And most of these uses, I'll use 13th Street as an example. It's a dilapidated, there's homeless people living actually on the street at Mission and 13th. These are areas that are run down, that are need a refresh. So again, this idealism, this ideagogue, whatever you want to call it, that planning continues to promote will not act. These 600 units are phantom units, ladies and gentlemen.
They're what?
Phantom unit, phantom. Phantom of the Opera, phantom.
Well, let's see what your neighbor says. Jesus.
Can I just add to that? I think one thing you need to note is this policy is not saying you have to do commercial on the whole NBD. Actually, a lot of the NBD currently is residential uses. So on those properties that are currently residential, you can build all residential. So it's really more about preservation of what's there, enhancement of what's there, but not requiring additional commercial to be built.
Jesus? Yeah.
I have several comments and a question. In reference to what a successful business is, I believe we had several discussions with BIG. I believe that any business who has been in San Jose and has been there for more than 3 years is a successful business. Why? Because he's been producing enough money to pay for his own expenses, rent probably, or mortgage, pay for their own food and expenses for their kids. So once again, over 3 years, we call it a successful business because it's still alive. And again, it's not depending on any government or any credit from anybody. Businesses don't get credits. Just a quick comment. A female business owner has no maternity leave or family leave support. So if a female or if a woman business owner gets pregnant and then delivers a beautiful baby, usually 2 weeks after, they have to be back on their business and working again. So once again, 3 years to us is a successful business. Now, a lot of these businesses are in areas, and I agree with that need to be renewed. It'll be beautiful if we can renew those areas and bring those businesses back to enjoy the progress that we are creating. In one of our discussions, and once again, I want to say thank you first. Thank you for all of the work you've been doing, and thank you, Director Wallace, for all of the work, because for the past, I would say 9-10 months, we've been working together with BIG and Jeff Roster and Kim and Chris and all of their department. They're going to the corridor, they're visiting businesses, they're talking to them, to each one of them, and they're asking them what their needs are. Once again, one of our discussions, we mentioned that, talking about Story, going back to Story Road, the majority of those businesses have been there for over 10 years. Is that what we said? 10 to 12 years. And if that is not a successful business, even though there might not be in a very beautiful facade, they don't look the best, they are successful businesses. It is, we said, about 500 businesses in Story Road and over 2,000 jobs created. How can we call those not successful? Those are successful business creating jobs. And I truly support the idea of creating the urban village in Story Road, but I think that for something like what to happen to Alum not to happen again, I think we need to work on an anti-displacement, resident and business anti-displacement study to come along with the designation of urban village or before, because otherwise we will be creating the same type of displacement. We lost over 60 businesses during the BTA construction, the small businesses in Alum Rock, and Story Road has more businesses than Story Road, I believe, as per the numbers that you mentioned. So again, that is my comment. I do believe that if each one of these businesses was to have an opportunity, they will thrive. They will thrive. And if we were going to be building new 100-unit buildings and we were able to accommodate or re-accommodate those businesses back, we will do a lot for our city. And we will do, Shiloh mentioned about the culture asset of having those businesses. If we don't pay attention to that, giving an opportunity to businesses to come back, we are just creating spaces for Starbucks, Panda Express, Jamba Juice, which are businesses that you see you see them everywhere, but you don't see the Calle Willow Florist, you don't see the Piñata place in Calle Willow as well, or on Alum Rock. Those are the ones that we want to keep, and I think we should be working to keep them in our city. That's my comment.
Thank you. Thank you, Roberta.
Thank you. I have 2 questions and then a comment. So is staff recommending 100 units in each of these 6 areas, or 600 units in each of these 6 areas?
So it'd be a 600-unit pool
Total.
that would be available to all the areas. So instead of allocating, 200 here, 100 there, it would just be, be a pool of 600 units that could be used for all for the different NBDs that this would apply to. So Japantown, North 13th Street, Willow Glen, and then Calle Willow.
Got it. And what's the density?
So that we're still working on. That'll be a follow-up item where we would be looking to set densities appropriately for each of the different NBDs. As Michael mentioned, we're probably looking something around 3 stories or so, with the exception of Japantown along Taylor Street, given the current development patterns there. It'd probably be appropriate to have something a little higher, 5 or 6 stories.
Okay. And then my other question is, it's slide 4, rising rents. Why is this an issue in California? There's no commercial rent control or specific tenant protections. Are there any cities that aren't having problems with rising rents that have commercial rent control or tenant protections in the US? And if so, what are they?
That's a big question. Different states have different laws. So you have to look at each state and see what specific legislation is in place to protect business.
Do you know of any?
I do, and they don't necessarily work effectively, but you can look at the big examples, which would be New York City, and I would draw reference to a major academic piece that was published a month ago by the Pratt Institute, which set out 15 years of history of planning and change in relation to small business and the use of different policies. And essentially, it identifies, if you like, the successes and the losses along that way. Other cities for whom we've directly compared when we produced our paper for the study session last October, and there's an annex that shows the work we did in looking at Seattle, Portland, and Austin as direct comparisons. That I would sum it up by saying each city adopted its own strategy. So in Austin, they went for preservation. They targeted older buildings and wanted to preserve the building as distinct from the occupant of that building. In Seattle, they went for a very zone neighborhood-based form of control. And in Portland, they looked at a more economic neighborhood strategy, which was much more heavily reliant on transit development and more TOD-driven. So each city had its own way of looking at that. What's evident looking at the policy link work that we've done, which is a national confederation of different cities across the United States, is there is no unique magic wand solution to the question of addressing small business displacement. Each city has to define for itself the correct approach. And that really drove the thinking behind a pilot. Rather than assume we knew the answer, we thought, let's test the proposition. And let's inform both colleagues internally as well as the community at large on how they would want to see that developed.
So I appreciate you protecting small business. I agree. Small business does bring the character of the neighborhood. It improves it. And I'm glad you're looking at it more generally, not just specific rent control.
Yep.
And I'm glad you studied the, is it the Pratt Institute? Because they say rent control does not work. What you're talking about is not rent control.
Correct.
What you're talking about is preserving business.
Yeah.
Very, very different.
Yes.
And I want that highlighted for this, because your slide's misleading, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, understood.
And then the other comment I want to make, and this crosses all 3 areas we're voting on tonight, and I don't want to wait till the end. I want to go back to what Sean said. You're looking at disrupting 6 neighborhoods that maybe need some revitalization, but only for 600 units. And I want to go back to what Sean said about doing the math. If we could move Granite Rock and the other industrial businesses to another area, and we have high-speed transit, we could have 4,300 units and 1,600 jobs there. And so I want us to rethink this as far as what's going to work for our city. And the key point I want to make is, which I haven't made yet, is what makes property values and what preserves property taxes is uniformity. And what's being proposed in the last part in all of these is antithetical to uniformity. It's taking single-family residential areas a half mile from transit and saying you can build 6 units or 4 units.
I think it's Juan.
It's going to reduce property values. It's not good for our city. I'm trying to say this nicely, but it's bad planning.
All right, Councilmember Foley.
Well, Roberta, you just stole all the words I was going to say. And so I'll reiterate them. I really, truly appreciate that you're working to protect small businesses. Small businesses, businesses who've been around 3, 5, 30 years need that. We need rents that are, we stay where we are because rents are lower. We don't move into bigger buildings because we can't afford the higher rents, because that affects our overhead. And I don't disagree that some of these neighborhoods don't need to be refreshed. They potentially do need to be refreshed. But I'm very concerned that we are having this long discussion over 600 units when we really need to build many more units than that, and we're really just borrowing. We're not borrowing, we're taking 600 units we've already allocated somewhere else and moving them to these places that will result in total disruption for these small businesses, many of them successful, some perhaps not, but many of them already successful and thriving. And I will argue that they will not thrive when they are moved. When they are relocated out of their neighborhoods, even for 6 months, for a year, whatever it is, and even if they get to move back, that disruption will affect their business cycle and their ability to maintain their business, which also maintains their employees and maintains their ability to pay their rent and their housing where they live. So it's a whole trickle-down effect if we move these small businesses. If we're going to designate these areas to build residential housing, I'm fine with that. But please, let's shoot higher than 600. And I agree about, I understand the whole EIR and then desire not to do that. But if we're going to go to this effort, we should be building more than 600 units and not taking 600 units from someplace else.
Thank you, Councilmember. Okay, on this side, and tell me if I've gotten everybody. Harvey, Jason, Margie, Melanie, and then we'll go back to Tomiko, Jeffrey, and Juan.
Thank
Is
you.
it Bob? No. Oh, was it Bob? Okay, and Harvey.
Okay, thank you, Harvey Darnell. I want to reflect and second the comments that Councilmember Foley made. I don't know your name in the corner when you were talking about small businesses. Because I live in Willow Glen, and the north end of Willow Glen, and I've talked to a number of small business owners on Lincoln Avenue who have concerns because they're in buildings that were built in the 40s, 50s. They're kind of shabby, but they're okay. And because of the pedestrian traffic on Lincoln Avenue, they're very successful for a fairly low rent. And they're very concerned about being displaced, and where would they go? And as Councilmember Foley said, just losing that one area is going to be devastating to their entire business model, because they can't really be relocated. They won't get the same kinds of amenities. That said, I talked to Michael Mulcahy, who is a managing partner of Next Gen Partners, which holds a lot of the land on Lincoln Avenue, particularly on the west side. And I've always wanted to see businesses, when they're rebuilt, to be built with housing above it. And I think that's a good idea. I think that you want to make sure that you keep because Lincoln Avenue is pedestrian friendly now, we've gone through that whole process of traffic calming and putting bike lanes down and slowing the traffic and putting in all the pedestrian crossings with lighting and et cetera. We want to not kill the golden goose. I think Lincoln Avenue is one of the major areas that we get tax revenue from. Is that not correct? Office of Economic, you're over there, yeah. Is
Okay.
that not one of our larger tax revenue sites?
Let's continue, Harvey.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, please continue.
Okay, and so I want to make sure that whatever we do, and Michael was very concerned about that, whatever we do does not kill that continuity to make it a successful business district. That said, what are you going to do in terms of the differences in the lot sizes on the west side and the east side? The east side of Lincoln Avenue has very narrow, not very deep lots. The west side has much, much deeper lots that would support much more higher density housing.
Thank
So
you.
that's a question for you.
Staff?
Yeah, I mean, we're not proposing, at least at this level, to propose a difference from the west side or the east side. I mean, I think, what we're seeing is, starting to see is more and more interest and feasibility in developing smaller sites. So if someone could make it work on the east or the west side, I think this proposal would support that. What's really critical is ensuring that you have the space, the depth that works for retail and small businesses, and so we have design guidelines that address that. So development would have to adhere to those guidelines to ensure that the commercial space being created in terms of height and depth and width actually is viable space that could be used by a business.
Well, I will echo the same comment that was made over the 100 units per area. For us to make any kind of accommodation for housing, we really are going to need much more higher density on the properties that we're able to support that. And there are several that will support that in that district.
Good. Yes, staff wants to
Staff
respond to that,
wanna
and I think it's an
clarify-
important item for you to respond to, please.
So the 600 unit, that's just an initial right now. Every annual review and every 4-year review, you could replenish and seeing how the demand works and actually move units for the pool.
And given the discussion around small business displacement, we wanted to be sensitive to that and balance those concerns, and which is partially why we're looking at it. We think that's a good approach with 600 units, and if it's a success and we see successful projects move forward, then certainly it would make sense to shift more units, or as we add units to the general plan, either through the housing element update or future 4-year reviews or comprehensive updates of the general plan, we could do move units as needed at that time.
Okay, Jason, and then Bob.
Cool, thank you. I have a question and then kind of an overall comment, and you kind of answer the question at the end of it. I'm kind of curious as to what the current vacancy rates are along these corridors, and I don't know if I missed it in the readings or not. And I ask that because after Shiloh's comment, I realize I share a lot of the same concerns in that I want to be part of the solution that builds housing in our city. What is hard to kind of negotiate is we're targeting neighborhoods that are the greatest attractions of our city. And it almost seems like we are putting a lot of pressure on destinations that we want to already highlight. I want to acknowledge that there is a possibility that having additional housing in these neighborhoods could add to it, but there's also a risk. And if we do have 1 or 3 last Japantowns, if we do have Calle, Willow, which has one of the best sushi burrito, mixes, these are very, very unique places that we have. These are places that are in all our brochures, all our magazines. This is what we promote to the greater Bay Area when we say come to San Jose. And it just seems like at one point, sometimes I hear that these areas are not doing well, and then I also hear that these places are thriving, and I'm kind of a bit confused as to which ones are which, and maybe they're all different. And so I do like what Jesus talked about in terms of the anti-displacement strategy for businesses, but I just want to make that point, and these are 2 very important things for our city. Some of the most place-defining elements of our city and addressing the extreme need for housing here. And I hate to be in the position where we have to negotiate both of them if there's other opportunities where we could find more housing. And so my first question is where the current vacancy rates in them, and the second is if you could just respond overall.
Yeah, so I don't think we have the specific vacancy rates on the corridors, but we can certainly pull those. That's information that we have available. Generally throughout the city, commercial vacancy for retail is low, and generally what we see is in our neighborhood business districts, it's lower than the sort of broader retail sense, including the strip centers and places like that. So generally speaking, yeah, most of the spaces are filled. I think to Jesus's point, what defines a thriving business, and in many cases, these are businesses that have been in existence for a number of years and, are making it in their location. So we consider these, good commercial areas that are currently successful.
I think the one point I'd like to add to that is we did some analysis of how long businesses have been located in the neighborhoods, and certainly in Calle, Willow Glen, and Japantown, businesses on average have been located there for over 10 years. That gives you a sense of stability, and when I personally walk up and down Alum Rock Avenue and look at individual premises, it's self-evident there are certain locations that have never been let, just as there are other locations that are permanently let, and there's a third category of premises that appear to be the ones that people absolutely want to be at. And so it's not a uniform answer. You've got to get really into the granularity of each of these particular neighborhoods to understand location. And sometimes a headline statistic of sort of 2% or 10% as a vacancy rate can be a bit misleading to the actual nuance of what it is in the street itself. And also the particular requirements of a landlord or the particular needs of a tenant make that on occasion a difficult judgment to call as to whether an area is being successful or not. The other point that was asked around sales tax, and from looking at some of the broader figures, not the specific figures, these neighbourhoods are remarkably consistent in the sales tax that is produced, and that's another indicator of stability. And you wouldn't compare those neighbourhoods to, say, major shopping malls, for instance, in terms of the amount of sales tax being produced. What you would look for is the range of sales tax that's produced over the years, and you can see within 3 of the 4 neighbourhoods, again, a consistent picture.
Thanks, Vic. Bob?
All right. Thank you. I think the overall concept of what's being tried here, promoted, it makes a lot of sense as far as increasing the housing and trying to maintain the commercial districts, because we want to make sure we keep our jobs here. We have an incredible deficit from a city perspective, and we also need a lot more housing. But it's very vague on what's being proposed, as you can tell by the questions that are all being asked here. For example, when you go to 3 here, it says how many stories, we don't know, how many dwelling units, we don't know. So where does that 600 number come from if we really don't know how we're going to be allocating it? And then also what's being applied to places where we actually need to promote this kind of policy, where we want to see additional development, we want to see areas revitalized. And it's being applied to areas, as we mentioned, Willow Glen, where we don't want it, when we may not necessarily want to see it there. So there's a lot of confusion from my perspective as to how we really want to apply these policies. They make sense from a high level, but when we get into the details, it gets very vague. So I'm really not sure whether to support it or not with the way it's currently written.
Thank you. Melanie?
So I wanted to also talk about the details and more from a practical side of things. So if we start from the position that we generally support the policy, that we want to preserve our businesses and also encourage residential. One thing that I was struck in looking at the lot sizes in particular of most of the places in these business districts is that they're really small, and many of the businesses are connected. There's no driveway that's accessible at the front, and I wonder if we're not talking about parking, and particularly what our parking requirements are going to be for the residential, then we're essentially creating phantom residential units, because if we are requiring the parking requirements at the same level that we require for the rest of the city, if the driveways need to be two-way driveways that are 26 feet wide, those are going to basically eat up all of the ground floor, and you're not going to be able to adaptively reuse your commercial structures. You're not going to be able to develop the upper floors. And so I think we really need to have a conversation about, is it preserving our existing businesses as they are and adding residential, or is it parking? And if it's parking in there, that is not going to allow us to develop the vast majority of the sites in those neighborhood business districts. So I think that needs to be part of the conversation and really a practical consideration, because when I looked at the charrette, I was like, that's not what our lots look like, and that's not 100% replacement of the commercial spots, and there's no parking lots on there.
And that was an AARP charrette, but did you want to respond?
I did, yeah. So we received a grant from Mike Bloomberg for our Climate Smart to implement our Climate Smart plan to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and our impact on the planet. And so one of the key items that we're working on is revisiting our parking strategies. So we'll be going to council in August with this, but just don't want to spoil the punchline here, but we're exploring getting rid of parking requirements in the city of San Jose, citywide.
Okay, so then that makes me really happy. I'd also like to not have maximum dwelling units be part of the conversation either. But the last part is actually on the building code side of things, and I don't know if there's any flexibility or something to also think about, but I noticed that a lot of these buildings are attached, and I, when I think about some of the great cities in New York, you have all of these attached residential buildings, but I don't think that complies with current building codes, and so I also wonder, how do you put residential on top and still meet current building codes without some flexibility in that? I don't know if that's something that can even happen, but thinking about how could somebody actually build residential on top and keep the existing buildings. So those are just some things that I wanted us to think about.
Staff, we have about 20 more minutes on this topic, so do you want to respond now, or shall we move on?
Well, I would say, I think for adaptively reusing it, what we're proposing is that you would just have to reuse it, the building if it was a historic structure. So that would be the requirement. So it's not NBD wide. So if there's a structure that's not historic, that could be demolished and then rebuild. What we're proposing, you would be required to replace that commercial space, but that could be within a new building. It doesn't have to be reused from the old building. So just as a clarification.
Okay, Tomiko, Jeffrey, Juan, Shiloh, Kevin, and then I see you over there, Michelle. If we can be crisp in our questions, that would be great.
Thank you, Planning and Office of Economic Development, for all the work that you've done. I'd like to make a comment about the Japantown overlay. I was initially in support of it because I think there are certain parcels that are underutilized along that stretch, but then hearing that there's a potential of extending it to 5 or 6 stories seems very unrealistic to me, given that all the properties are immediately adjacent to single-family homes. And I can tell from, as a resident and an owner of multiple small businesses in Japantown, that bringing more density and construction into an area that's already seeing a lot of construction has had a very deleterious effect on our businesses. And even though I do agree with the climate change, like the movement towards reducing the number of cars on our streetways, it is kind of unrealistic for our neighborhood just right now, in the sense of adding more density without the infrastructure, because it is impossible to get in and out of our neighborhood during rush hour due to the changes on Heading Street. We have a greater number of accidents. We've had increased pedestrian accidents as well, a couple fatalities. So I kind of vote for this, given the proposal.
Thank you. Jeffrey?
So, with these proposals, first, well, two questions. First, it would be good to hear from staff why these particular districts. I think you've heard some concerns echoed throughout the committee around, some particularly sensitive communities that are looking to be potentially upzoned here. So it'd be good to hear why these. But then also, it just strikes me, since largely this is older commercial stock, that there, with this kind of upzoning, there's a potential for possibly some value capture here. And what has staff been thinking about? Is there an opportunity to marry potential value capture with greater support, more robust support for anti-displacement strategies for some of these small businesses, or creating additional value in these communities by perhaps creating some more on-site affordable opportunities? It just seems like it just echoes to me the effort to kind of focus on building out density in our rent-restricted apartments, that we're going after areas where you have highly functioning, long-standing, minority-owned and immigrant-owned businesses, and trying to get density there, while not really kind of coping with helping those communities to deal with the kind of knock-on effects of that development. Realize this isn't the only strategy of densification in the city, but would be interested to hear whether the city staff feels like there's any opportunity for looking at value capture.
Thank you. Staff, should we move on for now, or are you going to respond?
What Chris is thinking, so while he's doing that, I think, so why these NBDs? So there are two groups of NBDs in the city. There's those that are urban villages and allow housing through that process that you've heard about. Then there's, I think, 5 of them which are not urban villages and don't allow housing. So what we're proposing is to allow housing in those remaining NBDs that currently do not allow housing. So we weren't singling out any one. It's basically this proposal would allow housing in all the NBDs in the city of San Jose.
And to the value capture question, I think it's something that we're looking at much more broadly at the moment. Obviously, understanding the impacts of changes in state law on the sort of urban village amenities program in other parts of the city is really changing our thinking about how we approach that topic. So there's probably opportunity for it in these areas. It's just we're going to have to think of that as part of a larger strategy.
Juan?
I'll try to be crisp, but I think I have 4 different comments, and I recommend in the future capturing the order of the speakers, because I think a bunch of people went ahead of me, and that's fine. I just know we're short on time. So first, I want to note that I believe that there's 2 sets of recommendations, and I am not going to talk about this slide, not the confusion, not the 600 initial units pulled in between 5 areas. And I want to say that I believe small businesses have not outlived their usefulness. I think it's chicken versus egg. I think we're seeing small businesses and we're saying, well, there's blight in that area. Well, no, it's because you haven't redeveloped anything, and that's why the blight is there. So I think that many small businesses are successful despite the blight. We've heard it, right? And so they're surviving. I appreciate the city's anti-displacement efforts. I agree that if more can be done, it would be great. I agree with Jesus, who's on the task force, that we need an anti-displacement policy for both small businesses and affordable housing. And so now I get to the good news, which is that I'm talking about 1,000 units. Could we go to the Story Road slide? Because we covered another recommendation earlier, I believe. Earlier or after? Could we go to the Story Road recommendation slide, please?
We haven't spoke about Story Road yet.
Okay.
That's an urban village. These are just the changes for the other NBDs.
Will this be discussed before 7:50 p.m.?
We wish for the task force member to vote on these changes that affects the 4 NBDs, and Story Road recommendations will be right after.
Okay. All right, okay.
Thank you.
So let me make sure I fully understand. Story Road will be covered, and there will be an opportunity
The topic
for a
after.
motion
Yes.
by 7:50 p.m.
Well,
That depends on how much the task force
We're going to
has.
get to it, Juan. We're not
Thank
going
you.
to.
I just want to make sure,
avoid it.
because
Yeah.
early on, we heard we're moving on at 7:50 to the next set, which is the
Great.
housing.
Shiloh, and then Kevin, and then Pat.
So I wanted to, we're wrapping up, which is great. I think we're moving to a motion, and so I was hoping that staff could just clarify exactly what the recommendation is and how strong, I guess I've seen language talking about preserving neighborhood business districts, and then that language doesn't necessarily refer to it, so I'm confused about like, what is the current policy? What are we voting on? And I guess I want to be assured that there is like real strong commitment to making sure that we're preserving these assets. And I think Juan said, you know, he said, if we're doing this, we want to make sure it's strong. And I don't necessarily want it to be an if. I want it to be like, and I think we're all on the same page. Like, I think staff wants to do this too. And so part of me saying this is just to like underscore these are really important assets, and we are creating the environment that is causing a potential displacement by increasing pressure to develop these areas. So we are causing this, we the city, through policies and potentially enriching people who own the property. And so there's got to be a way of figuring out whether it's value capture or whatever it is, of making sure that it's, you know, as I understand it, and this isn't to be critical, it's probably within the limitations of what you can do, but it's more than, you know, here, let me give you access, let me help you get access to capital, because even that is, you know, people are just, they can't even leave for maternity leave, you know? So I just want to underscore that. And then I just had to respond to a point earlier that said rent control doesn't work, because I am a product of rent control, and I am very special, and it works.
Michael, let's keep moving. Kevin, Pat, Michelle, and then public comment.
So I just want to say that I've gotten a little bit uncomfortable with some of just where the conversation was going, where we're pitting housing against businesses, and I think it's just a false choice, and it's just this lens and this frame that I think has not done the city well with any of its planning, and I just want us to be thoughtful of that when we're talking about housing, like invading or housing, coming into these areas that are good and stable, as if housing is a bad thing. Housing is not negative. I support this because I am really concerned about the areas where there has been thriving long-time businesses, and they get taken away and not replaced with any commercial, but that's not what the policy says. The policy here says that that commercial space has to be replaced. So maybe there's going to be some temporary disruption, but the places will still be there, but they'll be added to it with smaller apartments that are more affordable for people to rent. And then finally, the last thing I want to say is I think it's too modest of a policy. I'd love to see more units, but I'm going to support it because if this brings apartments to downtown Willow Glen, I'm going to be all for it. Willow Glen doesn't have apartments, not because people are trying to preserve the business space. Willow Glen doesn't have apartments because they're trying to keep low and moderate income people out of Willow Glen. And so this gets some affordable housing into Willow Glen. I'll be all for it.
Thank you, Kevin. Pat?
Well, I just wanted to make a comment. A lot of good comments here this evening, a lot of concerns that have been brought up. I also would support, I question the limit of 600 units, but I think it's a pool to start with. And I want to just raise, in a lot of these neighborhood business districts, each site is not exactly the same. We have sites that have basically parking lots in back of them. I'll use Willow Glen, Lincoln Avenue is one example. I also know on Calle Willow. So there's very creative engineering and design standards that can be utilized in order to provide housing in our neighborhood business districts. I think the housing that can be provided is very limited. But I will say that I think that what we're trying to do, just like with the ADUs are not going to solve the housing crisis. Housing in our neighborhood business districts are not going to solve the housing crisis. But it may afford the opportunity to add some housing in these areas. And I think we should try this. We should try to work with staff, and staff work with us and our existing businesses, and see if we can put more units in our neighborhood business districts, creates the foot traffic, adds the opportunity for some financial investment to refresh, because even Lincoln Avenue, and it is a joy, but it needs refreshing every so often as well. So I would just say that I don't think this is the end-all, be-all of how we're going to deal with housing. But I do think it's a beginning step to say we can begin to go back to that old model of business and housing on top and surrounding that provides those options for people that want to live in San Jose.
Thank you, Pat. Before we get to Michelle, if you do have a public comment, please go ahead and stand up and go toward the mic. Michelle?
Thank you. Pat, thank you very, very much. You said a lot of the things I needed to hear. What staff has been emphasizing is this is 600 units of a pool that we're going to see if it works. Every one of those little narrow lots isn't going to be developed with 4 stories of apartments. Many of those little narrow lots won't ever be redeveloped. Some of them will. Ingenuity is amazing when it really is applied. One of the problems of having planning commissioners on this particular body is we want to see the plans and the driveway and the setback and how tall is it and where are the windows and who's looking into whose backyard. So we can't do that here. This is too early. This will help. That's how we need to think of it. It's beta testing a new idea. Maybe it'll work. Maybe it'll just work a little bit. Maybe it'll be a fabulous success. But we won't know for a while. And you know, it isn't all going to happen this year. And so subsequent general plans will have a chance to decide exactly how tall the building should be in Japantown and on Willow Street. There's going to be plenty of time to, after they triple our arena or quadruple it or whatever it is, we can slap a bunch of those units into the NBDs, if in fact anybody wants to build in the NBDs.
That's right.
We've got a lot of time to refine it, to look at it, and to figure out where the driveways and the setbacks and
Thank
everything
you.
is going to work. It's a great idea. If it works, if people want it to work, then we'll see it be implemented.
Thanks, Michelle. Welcome.
Okay, hi. My name is Pat Gormley, and I live in North Willow Glen. And I've lived here for about 35 years, and I have spent a lot of time on Calle Willow as well as Lincoln Avenue. And just a couple of comments. Calle Willow, if you go there early on a weekday or even on the weekend, it's bustling, it's vibrant. If I drive home now through there, it's bustling. And it's not negative bustle, it's good stuff. It's stuff that makes community. On Lincoln Avenue, there's a different type of bustle. But on Lincoln Avenue, the rents have gone up. There are at least 3 storefronts that are vacant. And, you know, some of those businesses were very good. I used to patronize them, and they're gone. So I'm wondering about this notion about turning Calle Willow into business with high-density housing. I have the opportunity as in a service I provide to people, many of the clients are from that neighborhood, and I know they barely make it. So I doubt very much if those folks are going to be living in those fair market apartments, fair market rent apartments, or even if they're slightly below market. They can't afford it. So what are you going to do? You're going to end up populating that area with people who don't share the community of that neighborhood, and slowly, or maybe quickly, you're going to destroy the community that made it a good place to go. And if that's your intention, I think you're well on the way to doing that. So I wonder how many people in this group live in the neighborhood of Calle Willow. You don't have to raise your hands, but how many people live there? Also, how many people did outreach to get input from Sacred Heart and community groups in that neighborhood? I'm not hearing much of that. So I think what you're going to do is you're going to gentrify that neighborhood and you're going to ruin Willow or Lincoln Avenue. But it's yours to destroy, and it's up to you to do it. And you'll be remembered in history for a legacy of taking community and vibrancy and destroying it.
Thank you. And I'm sorry I didn't mention this earlier. You have 2 minutes to comment. Ed, please. We are keeping track.
Ed Rast, I actually live in Willow Glen, and I'm concerned that basically you have not had an open discussion with the people who are going to be affected by this. You haven't basically, I was a small business person for 30 years. If I was hearing this, I'd be upset. And I think one of the things that happens in small business, it's a way for people to get up into, into the middle class. They start off as immigrants or whoever. They come into the city and they get into the middle class that way. They work their way up by hard work. And what you're doing is you're killing off that, especially for women and other minorities. And so you haven't done the outreach that you need to do. You have a number of people who have been appointed here to represent each district. And I can tell you, almost all of the people who've under that list, they haven't talked to anybody in the district. They haven't come to the district leader group at all. They haven't basically talked to the neighborhood people at all. It's ridiculous the way you're doing this. As the comment was, if you want to ruin Willow Glen and everything else, you're well on the path to do that. But you need to go and take a look at the comments that Pam Foley made and Harvey made and other people made, that this thing needs to be pushed back and bring the people in and talk about it. Otherwise, you're going to have a problem. And it's going to be a big problem, and you're going to have a big revolt in the community. Thank you.
Thank you. Fred?
Hi, my name is Fred Buzo. I'm from AARP, California. And I'm only here really to talk about North 13th Street because that is the only area that we studied. You saw one of the slides from Marcia. The reason that we chose North 13th Street to focus on is because that was based on a council memo that was passed and adopted by the City Council in September of 2017. And in that memo, you'll see that the council and the mayor voted to look at what they called underutilized business districts. North 13th Street was one. Calle Willow's mentioned there, and so was Story Road. So that kind of began the ball rolling, I think, for those business districts. But we focused on North 13th Street, and what we found was that a lot of people are already living there. So the point of focusing on North 13th Street wasn't, hey, how much housing can we build? We want to just build dense housing, and that was it. It was about building good neighborhoods. And so when we went there, we talked to business owners, to property owners, to neighborhood folks, and we realized there's already a lot of mixed use on that street. Some of it has been around for over 100 years. And you'll be surprised what you can get on one lot and what exists already on one lot. But not every property owner only owns one lot. Some own two, some own three. There's one gentleman who's referred to as a Donald Trump of North 13th Street who has 8 lots. And so he's, sitting pretty. And so, but what is vacant and what is not vacant, who knows? There are some businesses there that from the outside look as if they are open. I can tell you they are not open. And there are businesses that have been vacant for 20, 30, 40 years in that neighborhood. And so it's an area that does need some love, but it's also an area that doesn't need high density. And so when we looked at what existed and what had historically developed in that area, we actually determined that there should be a lower density along North 13th Street than what currently exists. That was our opinion based on a current zoning designation known as mixed-use neighborhood. So that was our opinion after looking at the entire corridor.
Thank you, Fred. Welcome.
Hi, my name is Allie. I live in the Japantown, Hensley neighborhood, and I just wanted to share 2 comments. I 100% support Councilmember Foley and many of the others that made a comment that we need to see more than 600 units and not 600 units that are borrowed from another plan. We need more housing in this city. Like Shiloh, I'm benefiting from living in a rent-controlled unit, and we need to see, I realize we're not gonna get more rent-controlled units, but we need to see more units across the board. I support small businesses. I would be devastated if any of Tamiko's businesses went out of business because I love them and support them. So I hope that there is a way that we can figure this out where our businesses are not being threatened by a desperately needed increase in housing. I also just want to respond to another public comment that I moved here 2.5 years ago, and I am fully integrated into the community that I moved into, and so I think it's disrespectful to people that are moving to this city from elsewhere to say that when more housing goes into a neighborhood, the people that move in, whether or not they're from San Jose, from the Bay Area, from California, that they are not going to join the community. I think that's a very narrow-minded comment. Please be a little bit more welcoming to people that are moving from out of state. That's all.
Thank you. Okay, Pat, I saw your name played up.
Yeah.
Did you have a comment?
Well, I thought if we have no more public comment?
No, oh, I'm sorry. Yes, there is one more. I apologize.
Yeah.
I didn't see. Thank you.
I think I'm going to be different from everybody else that's here. I'm a victim, and I'm a victim towards what I'm going to be living in the future. And it's going to be, I'm going to be homeless. Why? Because I chose to go a way that most people don't go. And it was on defense of my own life and my own, how could I say it? Anyway, what happened was that I asked for help from my congressperson, and she told me she would help me with receiving a home or an apartment. And when that happened, I went down the line. And as I went down the line, I'm right now waiting for a due date that I have to leave on the 15th, my home. Why? Because I chose to bring a pedophile to justice and to go through the courts and everything else. And so now I'm losing my home because of that. And because he wants the house back. And it's family. And that hurts because I don't get to see my granddaughter anymore. But at the same time, I'm the one who's going through the hardship. And I've gone through all the agencies that there is to say, get a home or get an apartment, rent it, whatever you can do. And I'm the low level of poverty. And so I choose to speak up because when they say affordable housing, you know what the rents are going to be? They're going to be $3,500 for the people that can't afford it. And they're going to be on the streets. So that's going to be more people homeless. They're going to spend time out on the street, and then when they can't find any help for, for food stamps or whatever, what are they going to do? They're going to die. Because you know that I've been hearing that in the newspaper, but I work with the homeless. And I try to help them because I was homeless once, but now again I'm going out there in the streets. And who's
Sorry.
going to cover me? Who's going to help me? Are you, any of you, willing to take a chance and go out there and know what the people are going through or what they went through because they couldn't afford an apartment or a home?
Thank you.
It's important that we all go through that. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing. Are there any other public comments? Yes, please.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm a big believer of free market.
What's your name, please?
Oh,
Just for
hi.
the record. Thank you.
I'm Angus Liu. I'm actually from a little bit further away in Santa Clara, it's San Jose. So, so I believe in free markets. I believe that if you zone enough land for commercial and residential development, you will solve the issue of not having enough space to build apartments, not having enough space for small businesses, not enough space for these businesses to relocate, not enough spaces for people to relocate. I think we should expand the areas that are being looked at so that we can upzone and develop a little bit more. I mean, we're not sitting here and saying we should upzone the whole city from here to the mountains, but we're saying, in these existing business areas, we can probably do better than cutting bits and pieces of lots and saying, yeah, you can build a strangely shaped apartment here. Rather, if you took the whole square of streets surrounding and you upzone the entire blocks at a time, now your economics start to work out for developers to say, hey, we can take this entire area and build integrated business and housing development, and that way we can maximize the cost and reduce the prices for everybody once you have choices and ways to optimize for scale.
Thank you. Any other public comments on this topic? Okay. Pat?
Well, I know that we're time sensitive at this point, and I think we've heard a lot of comment, a lot of public comment, as well as task force. I would like to move staff recommendations under 1, 2, and 3. I would also like to raise, I know there is a concern raised about the 100% replacement on commercial. I would like to ask if that could be something that staff takes another look at, and between now and when it goes to council, potentially revise that to some degree or create some flexibility depending on the design of any proposed development that may come forward.
Second.
Do you have a lower limit that you would recommend, or just leave it open?
I don't. I'm not an engineer, and I'm not a designer. I would not want to presume, I know, but I do think there needs to be the ability for those that do that kind of work and that expertise to offer alternatives. And yet, knowing what the intent and the goal is to maintain and preserve the character of these neighborhood streets.
So, Michael, you've already seconded it. Do you have anything to add?
defer, he had his card
Okay. Any comments on the motion? Yes. He seconded already.
Thank you.
Yes.
I'd like to just actually, direct staff to, I think, again, this is a parcel, it's been mentioned, Melanie mentioned it, others have mentioned, it's a parcel by parcel type of look at this, and so maybe an industrial use you have industrial uses and commercial uses as full replacement. Again, we heard the example of 13th Street. There needs to be a case-by-case example. So maybe a Story Road in Alum Rock has more of a small business character, or Lincoln Avenue, but maybe there's other business districts that have, a higher vacancy. So again, I just think a 100% approach, it's going to limit density.
Thank you.
And it's going to make it very difficult for any type of housing to be built. So I don't have the answer, but I think Pat's recommendation to look at this a little bit deeper, dive deeper, and provides not necessarily just a draconian 100%. It's got to be on a
Thank you.
case-by-case example. So that's as much I can give.
I think Pat has a slight revision.
Yes, and so I would say on a case-by-case, site-by-site, and have staff take a look, and by the time you come back to council, that can be fleshed out and with more direct. And I also wanted to advise that my motion does not include number 1, because we have not discussed it
So that we can
yet.
still have the conversation about Story Road.
Yeah.
She initially said 1, 2, and 3. I apologize about that. Okay, Sam?
Yeah, I totally agree that we need to increase the housing supply as well as sustaining the businesses, and that's very important to keep in mind. My comment was about, have we engaged the community just like some of our public members share. So I'd like to make sure that we add into our proposal, our motion, that we fully engage the community and the businesses every step of the way. That's very important.
Thank you. I think staff has heard your recommendation. Yes, Jesus.
And I was going to mention that if there is a way to include that as part of the recommendation, to have, again, an anti-displacement for residents and also for business attached to each one of these areas or projects being recommended. As a business owner and as a representative of business owners, I believe that the sole idea of bringing housing next to businesses is a great idea for us. Because if you have a business and you're building right next to my business or right across the street from my business, a 100 unit, that's 100 families that might come to do business in my own business. So we welcome the idea as long as we can enjoy it, and as long as we can stay there in those businesses. The other part, in regards to the amount of units, I think that I also agree with their comments. If we're going to be creating disruption, we should also look into the amount of units. If it's possible to increase the amount of units, I think that will be also something to look at. And again, I think I comment on that. If we can attach, and I don't know how to say it, to include it on the recommendations, to have an anti-displacement attached to each one of these recommendations.
I struggle with that because that's a city policy. It's not a land use issue. It's not a land use, which the general plan is land use. So I don't believe saying we have to have a policy attached to a land use of the general plan is right. And I know the city's working on anti-displacement policies, but they're going to come in another mode, in another manner to the council, so.
And as we continue to comment on the motion that is on the floor, please limit your comments to a specific question or a specific comment versus anecdotes, please. First, Pam, and then Roberta and Shiloh.
Well, I was just going to comment about the outreach. We seem to talk about outreach every time we have one of these task force meetings. And I assure you that every developer who is bringing a project forth to city council will have to do tremendous level of outreach before it actually gets to our level. So there's a plan in place for outreach that already is required to be implemented, so I really don't think we need that in the motion. I think it's every developer who comes forward who's going to go into Lincoln Avenue or Calle, Willow, or wherever will have a plan that they reach out to the community, because otherwise their project isn't going to be successful.
And again, it is not in the motion, so we don't have to speak to it.
I just want to say I support the motion, and I appreciate your very thoughtful approach to the pilot.
Okay, Shiloh?
I wanted to support what Jesus mentioned about the anti-displacement piece, and if there's a difference between what we can do in terms of a land use versus policy, I'm wondering if staff can advise on how we might achieve the goal that the concern that has been raised here. And again, going back to what I asked earlier, just to clarify, like, what are the anti-displacement pieces that we have currently in place that can address that concern?
I'll turn over to OD. I think what we've heard, Shiloh, you mentioned this, I've heard a couple other people mention this, is that we are talking about land use changes there, but I think the issue of displacement we've heard is really a concern to many people. And so as we go forward with land use proposals, we can't ignore that issue. We need to come up with some thoughtful approaches or strategies of how we could mitigate that, or perhaps, in many cases, perhaps prevent that, or just look at how we would deal with that. There was the idea, we will, to that, there's a lot of legal mumbo jumbo going out the state that ties our hands, but we will look at the idea of value capture. Is there a way to sort of generate resources to help businesses relocate, or to build out tenant spaces for them in new buildings so occupy them? So those are the kind of things that we look at. So I think that's what we're hearing. We haven't heard a motion on that, but we've heard some comments that staff, that the task force members wants to ensure that we are thinking and coming up with approaches as this moves forward and gets put in place.
Thank you. Jeffrey?
Yeah, to that point, I'd like to offer a substitute motion to amend the staff recommendations to include a number 7, to include compliance, similar to complying with the city design guidelines. If we could put a placeholder in for complying with the city's anti-displacement small business policy, just so that we make sure that as developers are benefiting from this particular increase in value from the changes, that they're complying with whatever that forthcoming policy is. Additionally, and I'm struggling with the line edit here, but perhaps if we could, similar to how the city pursued an incentive, or is studying an incentive zoning policy before it will begin implementing the OEI policy, if we could have a direction to staff to explore an incentive zoning policy for these changes prior to implementing the general plan change.
So first,
2 amendments to the staff recommendation in a substitute
I only heard one
motion.
amendment. I apologize.
Yeah, so 2. So one is compliance with the
Anti-displacement
policy, right? So that would be number 7. But then in addition to that, before implementing number 2, to study a incentive zoning policy to capture the value of those changes. Okay, so right now the city of San Jose is doing a study around an incentive zoning policy in the Dearden area, and my understanding is that there's some looking at that study for other types of land use changes. Could we direct staff to be examining a value capture policy and incentive zoning policy for capturing the value of those changes?
So I don't get the sense that the motioner accepts those alternatives. Is there a second on the alternative motion? I don't believe so.
I agree with the first.
I think the first part, people understand a little easier, and I think that could potentially be included.
And just to be clear, I agree with the first, because my intention was
Yes.
not to talk about outreach, because I think outreach, we have different ideas of
Okay.
what good it is. It was just to attach the anti-displacement to each one of the units.
Yes, I understand.
And I
So,
think that will
the maker of the motion, would you agree?
Maker of the motion, I will agree to adding to this. We don't have an adopted policy.
No.
I don't know how we say.
That's right.
Yeah.
Attach a policy we
Yeah.
don't have. That's my
When the
struggle.
council adopts the
Yeah.
policy.
When and if the council
Subject to.
adopts a policy,
There
it
you
will be
go.
subject to that policy, said policy, when and if it is adopted.
Michael, do you? Yeah, yeah.
It's-
So he agrees.
Did we wait
Jeffrey?
for a second to see if there was a second on the substitute?
I
Before
did,
doing
I
the
did
friendly?
ask.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't.
Yeah, I thought
Smita?
there was a
Oh, I'm
second.
sorry, I did not see you.
Yeah.
I did ask for a second on the
Okay.
substitute. So they have agreed to accept the first part of your amendment. Do you want to continue with attempting the second part, which is the value capture piece?
Yeah, I think.
Or can we separate that into a separate
Yeah.
part?
If we wanted to bifurcate the motion, I'd be
Yeah.
fine with bifurcating the
Okay,
motion. Yeah.
I appreciate that, thank
Yeah.
you. Okay, so the motion is to accept items 2 through now 7, which includes incorporating any anti-displacement policy that the council approves. And may adopt. Do we have, can we take a vote, please? All in favor? Aye. Any opposed?
Yeah.
So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Any abstentions? 1 abstention. 2 abstentions. Okay,
Can we name off
Do-
the people?
Can I?
sure. Yes, comments?
The reason I
After.
voted against it, because I would like to see a mixed use in these areas, is that we are not guaranteeing that we're going to replace the commercial, and I think we need to vote, and I move that we vote on number 1.
We're going to get there in a moment.
Oh,
We
okay.
haven't even had the conversation about number 1.
All right.
We-
There's
we're-
a
Still away.
misunderstanding. So
Oh,
number
that
one
number
on the-
1.
On the slide and is not
Sorry.
what was moved. So what got moved
Look on
was
page
the
4.
staff recommendation on page 4.
Page 4 of your
So number
memo.
1 was about convert Story Road.
That's right.
Oh.
So the
The
memo
replace
incorporates-
100% of the
Oh, I
existing is in,
apologize.
Yes,
is
You've got
in the
that up
motion.
there, and I didn't know.
I apologize,
what you
yeah,
were
that is
referring to.
confusing.
Okay.
Yep.
You got it, okay.
It's
So-
not that, it's page 4.
So if I can interrupt, QLaw needs to capture what the vote was, and it went so
Yes.
fast. So I think we just need to know
So
the
now that
people
we've
abstained.
clarified what the motion is, for
Yeah.
those of you, let's take the vote again. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? They are David, Don, I'm sorry, I don't know your name. Steve. And Tomiko. Was there anyone else? And abstentions earlier, at least, were Kiyomi
I'm not
and
sure what we voted.
Susan. Sure. And Smita. Thank you. And David wants to make comments.
I just want to say I do support number 2 in the staff recommendation. I think there's probably general consensus on that we wanted to look for more opportunities for housing. I do support that part of it. The 600 units, I'm not wound up on whether it should be more or less. I think the big picture here that I do think there's general consensus on was we wanted to provide that opportunity as well as in neighborhood districts. I think the difficulty here is when we get into very specific recommendations here that are under number 3, and now a number 7 that's been added to that, or going to be added, or was added. A lot of these are already undefined, and it does create confusion. I think, Bob, you were talking about it. Tomiko, you were bringing up things about that. And it just shows the difficulty of trying to adopt some policies that may have an application in different areas that some of us like and some of us don't like. And so my preference is, if we had voted on this, would be actually just to allow this kind of specific planning to occur outside of this process and involve the community, as was suggested. I think there would be good consensus on many things. Like, for instance, on this 100% commercial. There are very critical, important areas in some of our MBDs. You would want that replaced because it might otherwise encourage displacement. There are other areas in MBDs, like on 13th Street, and I think Fred was mentioning this, that have had businesses on it that have been vacant for decades. Why would we replace an auto body shop there? So I think we could develop a consensus, but when we quickly try to apply this and think of it being applied to all areas, I think this was getting too detailed for the kind of general planning that we're doing here. So I don't know if that has any impact on what people want to do with the motion that was just voted on, but I just wanted to explain where I've come on this, because I certainly don't want to, and I'm sure there are other people who voted no who also support residential development in neighborhood business districts, but just had some problems with the complexity of this.
Thank you. Okay. Can we move on to what was item 1 of the staff recommendation, which is about Story Road employment growth area and converting it to an urban village? Does anyone have any objection to moving on and completing this item on the agenda? Go ahead, staff.
Thank you, Chair.
Teresa, I think there was still the motion on value capture with the bifurcation. So you
Okay,
moved on.
so, well, I was going to ask, I feel like we need to complete item 1. Can we then take on, and the value capture conversation? I feel like it's a whole new conversation.
I mean, I'm not
Would you be
sure if that's
comfortable with that, Jeffrey?
parliamentary, How that would work, but, you know, if there's another motion, I mean, so that was, there was a substitute, then there was a bifurcation.
Okay.
I think you would complete the bifurcation before moving on to another motion on number 1, correct?
Okay, yes, sure. Okay, so Smita, you seconded the bifurcation. His new motion is to, if you want to restate
so
it,
just
Jeffrey.
Before, so right now with the overlay in particular, and the increase of capacity in number 1 and number 3, the combination of those two activities for current landowners, this may well increase the value of this land. So the proposal would be for staff to come back with a value capture mechanism so that we could evaluate what's the financial value of these particular increases in capacity, and to come back with what kind of tools could we utilize as before the decisions are made to increase this capacity, that we have some kind of a policy in place to capture that value. Because essentially, once decisions are made to amend the general plan, to amend this particular overlay, the opportunity to actually capture any value that's created by these changes for folks that currently own this land will have lost it. And so it seems smart for this body, before approving these kinds of increases in the value land, given all the questions about displacement, gentrification, and other things, that we should also be recommending that the city explore those options before amending the general plan and this particular overlay.
Okay, do we have a second? Smita, I can't see you, so I will assume you're a second. Okay, is there any comment on this motion? And if we can get to a speedy vote, that would be terrific. So let's go this way.
Michelle has some.
Yeah, I see it there. Okay, we'll start on this side. Let's start with Harvey. And I just want to clarify, Juan, I will call you first at the next one, but I will not guarantee that we're going in order of when people put their nameplates up. It's just not physically possible. I'm happy to call you first on the next item, though. Harvey?
Okay, thank you. I support the motion as a member of the SAG, where we're working with Google on the value capture from their properties and creating community benefits and displacement possibilities. I see this as one where we could take that added value, put it into programs to help small businesses, particularly minority businesses, have subsidized rents in the new, more expensive buildings that are provided.
Thank you. There is some question about whether financing these kinds of business districts and development is within the scope of the general plan task force, and I'd love some thought from staff.
I think it does, it can fit. I think the point is we're kind of getting general direction. We're going to be exploring these things when we bring it back to council. We'll say these are these things we were asked to look at. We've looked at them.
Perfect.
And then present them to council.
Appreciate that.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. If we can have quick comments, that would be fantastic. I don't think yours is up, Andre. Michelle, I believe you're next, right?
I'm going to be very blunt. I have no idea what you're talking about, and I'm not going to vote to support something I don't understand at all. And I'm pretty sure there's no time to make me understand.
Yeah. Bob.
Yeah, I'm in a similar
Yep.
position as Michelle, and I'm really curious as to what staff thinks about it. What's the level of effort to do this kind of thing? Is it really a feasible, or is it sort of?
Okay. You don't have to respond, staff, actually, at this
Okay.
point, because it would require some analysis, I would imagine. Right. Melanie?
I'm also going
Vincent?
to be very brief on this. My concern with this is that we are kind of shoehorning in some of these broader concerns and broader policy concerns, whether it's anti-displacement or value creation, into a very specific area of San Jose. And if these are important things that we need to consider, those should be policies that we are putting into place broadly, not just for the people who happen to be lucky enough to live within the neighborhood business districts. There's other businesses that are going to be displaced, and if we think it's important not to displace them or they should be compensated, then those policies should be applied more broadly. And I think when we start to sort of add these little things into and add the specifics to David's point, we're maybe taking away the opportunity to have these broader conversations and more broadly applicable policies.
Thank you. Vincent, and then I'll call the question.
I'll oppose this because I don't believe council gave the General Plan Task Force Committee the direction to study this issue.
Okay. All those in favor of the motion on the floor, please raise your hand. Staff, are you getting those names? There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 hands. So hopefully you have their names. And, okay, can we move on? All, all right. David Beanie raised his hand now also, so that's an additional one. Right there. Okay, all those opposed? And hopefully you can look at the video later and see whose hands are up. Why don't you count the number of hands you see? Are we good? Okay. And then any abstentions? I think that is helpful. We have Jesus, 1 abstention. Oh, 2, I apologize. Steve, right? Thank you so much. All right, thank you all. Why don't we move? Motion fails, yes. Why don't we go to the final item in this section of the staff presentation? Thank you.
Haven't hit the big one yet. You haven't hit the big one yet.
On to Story Road. So here, Story Road NBD is a corridor bound by US 101 freeway to the south and Lower Silver Creek to the north, approximately 1.8 miles long and 106 acres. Now within the NBD, overlapping the NBD in a larger area is the Story Road Employment Lands Growth Area. It currently has a plan for 1,800 new jobs and encompasses 223 acres. The current public transit is a VTA line number 25 that runs through the Story Road NBD, providing local service 12 to 15 minutes on weekdays. And as part of the East Ridge to BART Regional Connector Capital Expressway Light Rail project, a future light rail station is anticipated at the intersection of Story Road and Capital Expressway. So shown here in the image, This NBD is auto-oriented with 2 to 3 lanes in each direction. Buildings are mainly single-story and set to the rear, and parking lots located near the street frontage. Physical characteristics in the NBD are open commercial centers, shopping centers with surface parking lots. So here's staff recommendation. So establish the Story Road Employment Lands Growth Area as a local transit urban village. Keep the 1,800 planned jobs and allocate from somewhere else a residential capacity of 1,000 units. Incorporate policies and strategies from the citywide residential anti-displacement strategy, which is to be considered by City Council in April 2020. And incorporate policies and strategies from the supporting small business Alum pilot program, which you've heard earlier. And that concludes staff's recommendations.
Terrific. Any questions, any comments? Juan, you're up.
All right, thank you. Thank you for squeezing it in. So let me first say, I first voiced this suggestion, I don't know, 2 or 3 meetings ago, and I appreciate that staff were receptive and that it seems like a good idea and that they recommend it. And I do want to say, so I grew up in this area. This is East San Jose, and at the time I voiced that we deserve opportunity and equity as well. And I appreciate, given the housing crisis, that this will, and that's the good news, 1,000 units. And so what I want to tell you is that this area deserves an urban village. We heard earlier that the timing matters, and the timing does matter. The light rail station is coming. You can take it to BART. We should have jobs and housing there. And so this area deserves the future housing and employment opportunities that an urban village or a local transit urban village designation provides. Otherwise, and this is what I see that the area would wither and die over time. What I see is that it's stuck in the past. There's less and less business traffic. Small businesses need that. And so I appreciate that what we've got here is incorporate policies and strategies from the citywide residential anti-displacement strategy and incorporate policies and strategies from the supporting small business Alum Rock pilot program. So I think that we are considering those. And so with that, I motion to establish the Story Road Employment Lands Growth Area as a local transit urban village, along with all the other staff recommendations. And I am open to amendments if they make sense.
Second. Okay, Councilmember Foley had a second. Any comments? Any questions, Sam? Yes.
I'd like to know that Story Road has businesses all the way from First Street down to where we're talking about.
True.
So wouldn't it be in the best interest of the community to include that area from First Street down, because all of them are businesses? So can I have an explanation on why don't we just include from First Street down?
So First Street actually is already an urban village. From First Street to Kelly Park, which is Keys, that's at that point not Story. That essentially already is an urban village. It's the Martha Gardens specific plan area. So I don't think there's a need from staff perspective to do there. Whether there's a desire to expand it into the Little Saigon area, that's not something we've thought about or talked about. But I mean, it's something that the task force had desired. It's not part of this, I think, the scope of this group, but it's something we could consider for the future.
Yeah, I think it would be good to see should we or would we or why, because if we can include that, I don't know what the community reaction would be, but I think it would be important to have a clarity on why it stops at Kelly Park, which is about center, and it starts at 101. So yeah.
So the direction we got was, I think, going back to someone quoted actually a memo from the council and the mayor on the scope, was looking at opportunities for housing, how you could integrate housing in some of our underutilized business corridors. So the Little Saigon portion of Story Road is not a neighborhood business district. So that's why our scope is, and our focus has been on an NBD. It's not to say that that couldn't be considered in the future, it just wasn't a direction that we were given to look at. And it's something that if council direct us, we could look at that, but it wasn't part of our scope.
Thank you,
Find out
staff.
for us.
Kevin?
Yeah, I just had a question about the 1,800 job capacity. What is that in relation or relative to what the amount of jobs is there now? I don't need an exact number, but is this like, this would imagine a doubling of the jobs? It's about the same?
Give us a second.
Yeah, there's.
But just, I mean,
Right.
not
There's-
exact, but just.
So I think in the Story Road MBD, there's roughly 2,400 jobs currently. So
this would be an additional 1,800?
that would be 1,800 new jobs.
Okay. And because this is a new urban village that's gonna, I know next meeting, or maybe the meeting after that, there's a topic of capacity, looking at capacity. So will this then be part of what's looked at? I mean, will this lead to a feasible Story Road process?
Particularly as it relates to the residential, because currently there's the jobs are already allocated there because it's an employment area. And then we were proposing shifting 1,000 residential units, and that would come from other areas of the city, and that would be presented as part of that larger conversation on where things are going. And we've got some other ideas around that too that we'll be discussing around capacity.
Thank you, staff. Jesus?
Yes, I just have a quick comment and a question. First, I want to mention that I support this recommendation, and I thank the staff for including the part about this being a potential area to support the small business program for small business anti-displacement. I believe this is kind of what I was wanting to include on the other recommendations. I mentioned it before that for us as businesses, it is great to know that we have bringing new development to our area because that will support us and support small businesses. And as you mentioned, I think your number of 1,800 new jobs, is that what you're considering?
Mm-hmm.
I think it might be even lower than what it will actually be, because it might be more than that. As long as you're preserving the businesses that are there at this time, I think it could be even more. So I'm in support of this recommendation. I just have one question. On the previous vote that we had, it was recommended to explore the bringing the replacement of 100% amount of commercial, bringing it down. This will not be included on the Story Road, right? This will be
That's correct,
separate.
it's separate.
Okay, because I just want to make sure that we keep this 100% in the Story Road.
So Story Road as an urban village is going to go through that process with community intensive, comprehensive plan and policy will come through that.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
where it would be applicable if this were designated an urban village, so if a affordable project were proposed under the task force's recommendation, it recommended to eliminate the requirement for any commercial space for 100% affordable projects, so that would be applicable for Story Road if it were to become an urban village.
And do you know when this will come to council for approval? Is this going to be presented to council before or after the last month? Because last month recommendation, I believe, is going to be seen on December?
That's what we've heard. They're all
December.
going together.
Oh, they're all going together?
Yes.
Okay, so we have time then to
Yes.
talk about that.
And with an urban village planning process, as she said, there is much, a higher level of engagement in the community.
Thank you.
So, Michelle, did you have your placard up? Or can we, and Harvey, I see yours.
I have a question.
Okay.
I don't see verbiage that talks about the 1,800 extra employment.
This area is already designated employment area, so there's already 1,800 jobs allocated to the growth area, so that's why there's not a need to reallocate growth from anywhere around the city. It's already there within that growth boundary.
Well, it would be helpful for me as I'm reading this much documentation know that, because I don't know that.
Okay, thank you. Is there anyone in the audience that wants to speak specifically to the Story Road Urban Village? Yes, Jerry.
Thank you, Madam Co-Chair. Jerry Dion. It just came to me when you were talking about this allocation of jobs, allocation of residential units. I think one thing that would be important for you to understand as task force members is when the staff says they're not adding new residential units, they keep telling you that there are going to be 1,000 more residential units here, 600 on the neighborhood business districts. I would hope that one of you would ask for transparency about where they are taking them from. Because a component of this is where are they coming from? They're going to be less available to other areas in the city. And many of you have expressed very strong objection to only keeping the number a zero-sum game. And so I would ask that one of you tonight or subsequently ask for a presentation on where they're coming from. Thank you.
Okay, any other comments before we respond to the motion on the floor? Okay, all those in
I do have
favor?
a question.
Pardon me?
I do have a question.
Sure.
So to Jerry's point, is it necessary that this remove 1,000 units from elsewhere in the city? I like the 1,000, and then, but to his point, we're not trying to take away from somewhere else.
Right. As part of the four-year review process, we're not contemplating adding additional growth capacity to the general plan, so it needs to be shifted from elsewhere in a balanced manner, and we'll certainly can provide the details on that. We're going to have a larger discussion on where capacities would be shifting around based on all the different work items that relate to capacities.
And that is scheduled for the next meeting. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay, motion on the floor. All those in favor, please raise your hand. Looks kind of unanimous. Is there anyone opposed? I see no hands. Any abstention? Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I would
Sam?
abstain until I get the answer relating to the inclusion from Central
Okay.
Road down.
Great.
I think that we answered that, so I just want to be clear that I just gave you the answer.
Yeah.
I can talk
He
to you
abstained.
offline.
That's fine.
Yeah.
I was abstaining.
Thank you so much, Sam. Appreciate it. Okay, the next topic is really important and really exciting. I'd love to see us get through the staff presentation and then perhaps some public comment on the item. I doubt that we're going to have time to talk about the recommendations themselves, but hopefully we'll get the presentation and maybe any clarifying questions from task force members, as well as public comment. Hi, Jessica. Who's up?
I am.
Nobody. Oh, okay, let's do it. They're all leaving.
I have a clarification question.
that?
I just want
Oh,
to make
yes.
sure on the last motion, I was referencing the slide on the screen, correct? Okay, because the wording in this packet is slightly different, and I was definitely talking about the screen. Thanks.
Okay.
What part are
Staff,
you?
you guys can look at it, and then we can always bring it back if there's a question at the next meeting.
Sounds great.
Thank you.
All right,
Please.
thank you, Teresa. Hi, task force members. My name is Jessica Spiawan. I'm part of the general plan team, and I'll be presenting opportunity housing to you today. So as part of the 4-year scope of work, City Council asked staff to explore allowing single-family parcels to allow 2 to 4 units per parcel under certain limitations. So limiting these parcels proximate to transit-oriented urban villages or immediately adjacent to residential parcels with existing medium-density building types. They also asked us to look at developing a set of design guidelines to maintain the character of a single-family residential neighborhood, allow flexibility for more units on bigger lots, clarify that any redevelopment remains at the discretion of the property owner, specify that it would be sensitive to historic neighborhoods, and validate that opportunity housing projects are cost effective. And as you can see, it's quite a bit of work. And so for today, we will be presenting the policy framework and some action plans and general plan amendments. However, there are going to be next steps and further analysis that we need to do, including analysis, outreach, a lot of zoning code updates. So it's a bigger effort, and we are seeking task force recommendation on the policy itself. draft policy itself. So some background, why do we want opportunity housing? So for the sake of San Jose's allowing up to 4 units per parcel, so duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, bungalow courts, and single-family homes, we are going to call this opportunity housing. It's similar to missing middle housing as described by Daniel Parolek of Opticos Design a couple meetings ago. In San Jose, missing middle is kind of used for 2 different terms. So missing middle as in the housing type, and also missing middle as in missing middle housing for the middle class. So the pricing component to it. Those are 2 different terms. So for the sake of this, we will call it opportunity housing, and this will only refer to the form, the building form itself. And so our goals for opportunity housing is to increase housing supply, provide housing type choices, provide less expensive housing options, and providing more housing in high resource areas. In high resource areas, that term is capitalized because it's a specific term that was established by the State Department of Housing and Community Development. And these areas of high opportunity, there are several indicators to identify those. Some economic indicators such as adult education attainment, poverty levels, job proximity. There's a few more, but there's also environmental indicators and also education indicators. So student poverty levels, math and reading literacy, and also I think there's a couple more, but there's several indicators to identify these high resource areas. So why do we want to allow opportunity housing? So we want to address historic housing discrimination practices that have commonly excluded low income and people of color from single family neighborhoods. And this is not only in San Jose, but this was a practice nationwide. We also want to allow more housing that are affordable by design. They're affordable by design because the comparison for medium and higher density development, those require steel or concrete, where these single family type homes would only require wood frame. So by design, they are more affordable. It also allows small builders to get into the game of building housing as well, to just increase the number of people that can participate in creating more housing, and also to follow trend of trailblazing jurisdictions that allow this type of housing, such as Portland, Minneapolis, Vancouver, which we'll talk about more later. It also helps achieve our goals in the city's housing crisis work plan, which is to add 25,000 more residential units by 2023, I believe. So there have been recent state laws regarding opportunity housing. SB 50 is the first one, and that was a package of allowing different types of residential developments near transit stops to encourage them near transit stops. And one of the items in the packages was regarding opportunity housing. So it proposed that property zoned for single family housing to allow duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes. However, it did fail to pass the state senate earlier this year, although we do expect it to come back again sometime later this year. AB 1279 is similar, but it streamlines only affordable opportunity housing type projects in high resource areas specifically, and affordable meaning moderate to low income population. This has only stayed in the Assembly but has not advanced in the Senate. And I know that neither of these bills have passed the Senate yet. However, they both have merit, and jurisdictions across the nation are also looking into this, and it seems like a good way to produce more housing. So our first case study is probably the most famous one and the most known one. So this was the first major city to allow multiple homes on all residential lots, and they included this in their approved comprehensive plan in 2019. They would allow at least 3 homes, inclusive ADUs, on all lots across the city. They would still maintain that 2.5-story height limit, but allow those 3 homes within those areas. And the main drivers for them is that they want to address affordability, counter segregation, and limit greenhouse gas emissions by building within these areas that already have development. The second case study is Vancouver. They did a zoning code amendment a couple years ago, and they would permit duplexes on 99% of their single-family lots. And the only reason why they wouldn't qualify is because most of the other homes are historic, or they have weird lot sizes, and so, or weird lot shapes, and so they wouldn't qualify. ADUs are also required on larger lots with duplexes to provide more opportunities for housing. And their primary goal isn't to produce more housing, it's to produce a variety of housing options to different socioeconomic levels. Our next case study is Durham. That also did a zoning code amendment in last year. So they wanted to allow duplexes, not citywide, only in the central and more dense parts of the neighborhood. They expanded additional allowable areas for townhomes. So in certain subdivisions, you weren't allowed to have duplexes before, but now they're allowed to. They also allow the use of a density bonus in order to get a triplex and a fourplex rather than a duplex, and also allows duplexes on smaller lots that would not typically be able to produce a duplex. And the two goals and drivers for Durham to create, to allow opportunity housing is to accommodate growth in existing neighborhoods and also addressing racial segregation. Our last case study that we're going to talk about tonight is Portland, and this one is also a big one. So they also did a zoning code amendment in August 2019, which was simultaneous to the passing of House Bill 2001, which also allowed duplexes, I believe, across the state for populations larger than 25,000 people. But Portland has customized it to their own city by allowing duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, and ADUs on a majority of the lots. The areas where they wouldn't be able to develop that type of housing are hazardous areas, and also on unpaved streets where development infrastructure isn't there already. They also allow density bonus to encourage affordability. They require a minimum of 2 units on larger lots, allowing the division of homes, the creation of flag lots, and they also removed a parking minimum. Something that's unique to Portland is that they did an individual and independent displacement risk and mitigation analysis to identify potential communities that would be affected by this. So our staff recommendation, how is this going to be implemented in San Jose, or what does staff recommend? We are considering 3 types of development to include subdivide existing buildings, building up to 4 units on vacant land, demolish existing and building up to 4 units, and all these developments are to be built within the building envelope that is currently R1 and R2. So the form itself will not be different. From the outside, it's supposed to look very similar in height and form to a single family home. And our intent is not to change the character of the neighborhood, it's just to add more units within existing neighborhoods. So we'd also recommend that this would be an over-the-counter permit, like single family homes currently, and the only 2 scenarios where you would have to go through a discretionary process would be court-style bungalows, because our zoning code does not currently encourage that type of development, so it would require a little more review. Also, properties on the city's historic resources inventory, we want the properties to be adaptively reused, and so to make sure that we're still keeping with the character, we'd go through a discretionary permit, which requires extra hearings and also notification of the neighborhood. So here are a few examples of opportunity housing opportunity examples that already are in San Jose. So these, there's about 5,700 of these properties, and the way we collected that information is that we identified all these residential neighborhood land use designated parcels, and then they were the ones that had more than 1 unit on them. And so these properties, these developments, these types of developments already are in the city. And they don't look too different from what's already there. As you can see on the left, you can't really tell in that Victorian, but there's 6 units in there.
One of our planners lives in that.
She took a picture for me, so. In the bottom center, you can see that that's what a court home is. A court home is, if you were wondering. So it's just multiple homes on a lot surrounded by a common driveway. So where do we recommend this? Staying true to the scoping item, we recommend opportunity housing on parcels within a half mile of a regional or local transit urban village boundary. That way, we're encouraging growth closer to growth areas and where we plan services. Additionally, for properties outside of the half-mile radius, we would allow opportunity housing on properties that share a property line with properties that are designated with medium or high density residential and existing medium or higher density residential development. So where it currently is and where it's currently planned, we want to keep the form similar. Here's a map of where these potential sites would be. As you can see, it's not concentrated in like one main area, it's kind of spread out throughout the city. So our recommendation for the locations of opportunity housing would yield approximately 47,500 parcels. And this would make up about 25% of the residential neighborhood housing stock citywide, so only a quarter. And also these parcels, 72% of these parcels fall already within a half mile of a high quality transit corridor, which is defined as a transit corridor with 15-minute or faster or sooner service at peak hours of the day. 60% of these properties are within high resource areas, which is more opportunity for low income and people of color. 30% are within areas of below city median household income. We just wanted to make sure that we weren't disparately putting the burden on people, on communities that are already disadvantaged. So we wanted to do that analysis. So that brings us to limiting displacement. We are recommending two different exclusions. And so parcels that are occupied by renters within the last 7 years would not be allowed to develop with opportunity housing. Also, rent stabilized units that are subject to the city's apartment rent ordinance, which applies to 3 units or more, would not be eligible for opportunity housing. So even if someone demolishes a property, and it had renters within the past 7 years, we would not allow it to be redeveloped with opportunity housing. And this is all based on SB 50. We modeled it after the exclusions after SB 50. So historic properties, we recommend allowing opportunity housing that adaptively reuses historic structures. And as I said earlier, it would go through a discretionary permit process, which requires hearings and additional notification. And we have to keep the historic character and value of the buildings. However, staff needs to update the historic resources inventory, which is an action item that we'll have to deal with, take on as part of this or as part of another effort. So additional considerations, this is kind of a later step. These are too detailed to deal with now, but we do plan to explore additional changes to other city policies to make opportunity housing a little more feasible. And that's parking requirement reduction, lot size minimum reduction, allowing flag lots, and then creating flexible development standards. So as I said earlier, there's a lot of next steps to this. The short-term next steps, we will bring our recommendation from tonight, along with all the other 4-year items, and then, so we'll see. Short-term.
Optimistic.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. And then there are long-term next steps. So it's a lot of additional analysis. And the timeline for this is up to 3 years, which is not completely surprising. For example, Portland took 4 years to start and get their ordinance approved. And it's taken, Minneapolis took a whole general plan update to complete and approve this type of housing. So it's going to take a while. We would bring this to City Council approval as an independent package with all the different analysis included. So our next steps, we have 2 items on the short-term list. We have to do a cost-effectiveness study to study whether or not these types of developments are feasible even for a small developer or property owner, and at what price they would be at, like what the result would be, what market would they serve, just to know what the purpose of it is and if we're meeting our goals. The general plan text amendments, we are recommending 2 different action items to memorialize the different action items that we need to do so that City Council can approve it and maybe prioritize it just as a step forward and in making it official in the general plan text. The other next steps are all long-term. A displacement risk assessment, much like the one in Portland, and identifying strategies to mitigate displacement. Zoning ordinance updates, additional general plan text amendments if we identify any. So we have to do the citywide design guidelines in order to keep the character of the neighborhood and make sure that it's an approved look to the building and blends in with the neighborhood. And we would also do public outreach. So there's 3 things to vote on for the task force, which I don't think we'll get to today. We'll see. So there are action items which I'm presenting, or which are listed in your memo, and maybe we don't have to go through it right now. The general plan policy framework itself, and then next step. So we're looking for you to chime in on the action items, either changing it or approving it. Same with the general policy framework, and if you agree or do not agree with some of the things that are stated in there, and also next steps and any additional ideas for analysis. And with that, I'll stop.
I just
Or
really
do
want
you
to
want me-
commend staff. I think the memo was excellent, and the presentation was excellent as well. Thank you. It's a big and important topic. Given that we don't have a lot of time, first of all, I want to ask if there's any member of the public who would like to speak to this issue. Please come forward. Let's hear from you first.
Should we start?
Yes, please.
Hi, my name is James Rincon. I live in the Buena Vista neighborhood. I'm also the chair of District 6 leadership or neighborhood leadership group. We're big supporters of DEV. But what I wanted to do is bring some things to bear in mind. And one is when you talk about high density or bringing in high density housing to certain neighborhoods, it does displace the starter homes. So neighborhoods like mine that are starter neighborhoods that are still affordable will be the ones that will be getting picked up by investors that will be, buying 1 or 2 houses at, $900,000 each. It's incredible that that's affordable, but that's what it is now, right? That's our reality. But we should sort of guard these kinds of neighborhoods, right? And the additional thing about high density housing, and a lot of people talk about corridors or high transit corridors. I have neighbors that work in Apple, right? So they have a point A to point B travel, right? They're the ones that should be living on these high transit corridors. They can get on a bus and they can go from point A to point B back and forth. But I have neighbors that clean houses, I have neighbors that do construction, and they're the ones that need the cars. And when they're the ones that are being placed in affordable housing next to transit, corridor, these places, they can't take their tools in the bus. They can't go from house to house on a bus, cleaning houses or fixing, or gardening. You can't take your lawnmower on them. And so I would certainly just caution the body that we should consider flipping that around, flipping that idea that affordable housing needs to be on transit corridors. It's the working poor that need their cars, and it's the white-collar people that have one job, one destination that should be taking those buses. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Hi, again. My name is Allie, again. So in this capacity, I am representing South Bay YIMBY. And I just want to say, I live in the Japantown, Hensley neighborhood, and I walk by duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, cottage courts between here and my house every day. I am so thrilled that this task force is encouraging this, and I am in love with the staff report, and so I just wanted to encourage everybody on this committee to continue supporting this type of housing, because I live in a sixplex, which I guess is not going to count towards this, but it fits within the neighborhood. It takes me forever to even figure out that half of these houses are actually duplexes and triplexes. This housing is critical to building up our capacity for bringing more people into the city or getting people off the street. So I just really want to support and commend staff for all of the work that you've done on this report, because it's fantastic.
Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Edward Salm, here wearing a couple different hats. First, as the Planning and Land Use Director for the Shasta-Hanchett Neighborhood Association, the entirety of which is inside this proposal that's before you. We spent, as staff knows, a couple of years helping to develop the Alameda Urban Village. And so what this essentially is offsetting that line to kind of establish the boundaries. So thank you to staff for the level of comments and acknowledging the timeframes that Portland and Minneapolis went through, because this needs the same kind of community engagement, the same kind of analysis that the Urban Village did, because it will have a substantially larger effect on the neighborhood as a result. One other thing I want to say, I would recommend that the task force require that the additions to the HRI be completed first. As the chair of the city's Historic Landmarks Commission, I unfortunately am seeing the very slow-paced Juliet. If she didn't sleep at all, she might be able to finish the HRA in a timely manner. Unfortunately, we keep her very busy. That needs to be completed first, because, an example, the house I live in, it was built in 1896, and it's never once even been looked at for putting on the HRI. And there are other properties that now, mid-century modern, 50 years or more, need to be considered for the HRI so that these resources aren't lost as something like this moves forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Hey, Larry.
Yeah, my name is Larry Ames. Some questions also about the transit. I happen to live on a street that has a bus that comes every 15 minutes. That's nice. They started that service a few months ago, and they can easily change it again. So would they allow high-density housing, and then the bus routes change, and then it's not there anymore? I'm worried about the disruption to historic neighborhoods. There are large sections in Willow Glen and downtown, and there are houses made in 1920s and 30s. You'd lose the character if you do this. So check to see some historic neighborhoods. And also, who pays for the infrastructure? If you have 4 times as many people living there, you need more parks for these people. You need more libraries, schools. You need better plumbing in the streets and the transit. So will the developers be charged taxes to pay for these things, or will the taxpayers be stuck having to provide these services? These are questions to ask here. Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Angus again, and just a little story real quick. So we have a lot of interns at NVIDIA. I don't present the company or anything, just an employee. And I love our interns. They come here for the summer, and they're just sort of stuck, like some of them to a house, or they're like living all the way out in Alviso, and there's like 4 or 5 or 6 of them into a single house. And the reason for that is because the landlord has turned like the kitchen into a bedroom. They've turned like the living room to a bedroom, and there's Airbnb every single house out. By letting sort of like quadplexes or perhaps even larger in more areas, which really we're already fitting as many people as in a house as possible, really just improves the quality of life for a lot of our temporary and permanent residents around. Having private entrances is nice, having private bathrooms is nice, and really the number of people doesn't really change in these circumstances. I know it's not huge, but it's one of the things you could potentially consider is near high-density workplaces, also allowing this to happen in addition to areas near transit. All right, thank you.
Thank you. Matthew?
Good evening. Matthew Reed from Silicon Valley at home. Unfortunately, our director wasn't feeling well, and so she's looking forward to participating when it comes back next time. So I wanted to make a couple comments. We were actually really pleased. We thought it was really great work. It was thoughtful, it was reflective, it engaged and stretched the council direction in really important ways, and so we're really excited about that. We're supporters. I think we absolutely support the direction, and we'll support the effort. We have a couple of ideas, though. One I think is telling is that if we remember back to the presentation from Opticos, a lot of what we saw were 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 unit buildings. We saw one that looked like a single-family home that apparently was 8. And we think it's worth looking at slightly higher density within a closer range around transit-rich environments. I think we were all impressed. It was a couple months ago. I'm sorry we've lost some of that energy, but maybe it'll come back next time. We also think that this is something that should be considered citywide, and we understand that this is beyond the scope of direction, but we do think that this group has the ability to make a comment that staff can share with council, that it thinks it's worth exploring this kind of very modest upzoning citywide. The more homes there are in the city, the fewer people will be driving 2 hours to get here for work. And so it really, the long-term benefits are great next to transit, but really within the city footprint. Thank you.
Thank you. Hey, Matt.
Hi, everyone. My name is Matt Gustafson. I work for Somos Mayfair. I'm not speaking on behalf of Somos Mayfair tonight. I'm speaking just as a resident in downtown and a student of urban planning at San Jose State. Again, I would like to echo the comments. I really appreciate the report on this that we saw tonight. I just found it as we were sitting here and was really impressed by how comprehensive and long it was. I didn't expect that level of detail, so thank you for putting all that time and work into it. I would echo everything that Matthew said. I want to make sure here that the goals that we're trying to achieve, some of which are to kind of redress past harms about segregation and racial exclusion of certain communities, that the mechanism that we're trying to use with opportunity housing to redress some of those harms is actually thoughtful and we think is going to achieve some of those things like closing equity gaps that I think are part of the impetus, the moral impetus for a change like this. I have a stat of, I think 26% of San Jose residents are Caucasian, but 46% of homeowners are Caucasian. So, this potentially could be a change that disproportionately benefits a group that's already, historically been privileged by this very law. So I would also like to consider a conversation around value recapture for this change. I think we're potentially talking about tens of thousands of parcels that will automatically, my home included, all of a sudden be worth a lot more money, so because I can build more units on it. I think we're talking about, to the point earlier, for the gentleman who referenced the laborers who live in certain single-family homes. I believe I heard that rental housing was excluded from this, and so that would take care, I think, of a lot of those types of concerns, as many folks who work in service industries happen to be renting as well. So, and finally, I would just like to float the idea that Matthew already brought up. Why not expand it to the entire city of San Jose and 175,000 single-family homes that we currently have?
Thank you. Hey, Ed.
At rest, get lower. Again, what happened is that there's been little or no outreach to the neighborhoods. And basically what happened, for instance, the council members appointed people to be the representative of the neighborhoods for their council district, and they've never come out. Most of them haven't ever. When I talked to 6 of the district leaders this afternoon about this, they were unaware that this was going to come up. They were under the impression that essentially this was not going to occur until the state actually went forward on it. So it's a good idea that we're starting to do early, but the issue you have is you don't have outreach on the thing. And therefore, you haven't talked to the neighborhood leaders at all on this, and you need to do that. It's very important to do that. Otherwise, you're going to have a lot of pushback on it, on the whole thing. So that's my end of my comment on it. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Pat Gormley, and what I would recommend is, along with the other aspects that are being considered, is environmental justice in a neighborhood that is targeted for this type of development. There are neighborhoods in proximity to transit thoroughfares that incur undue environmental stress due to noise, particulate matter from diesel, and just disruption, inability to get a good night's sleep. So I'm talking about the North Willow Glen Gardner community. We're right on top of a transit corridor, so I think we're ground zero for this project. But the stress that it would bring to, I would say probably younger families would likely move in. They will lose Fuller Park due to the Diridon the new disc plan. So the 2 blocks of green space that we know is going to go away. So I think care has to be given to the quality of life that these people will experience if they move into a corridor with air traffic that goes pretty much all night, 2 major highways, and a train that, according to the VTA Diridon plan, it's going to be in the neighborhood of 500 trains a day going through that corridor. So environmental justice should be considered as a key component of any development. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Given the late hour, and in order to be able to jump back into this, I think, really quickly at the next meeting, I'd like to ask any staff, any task force members, if you have questions, clarifying questions about the memo or the presentation, to email them to staff so that we can start the next meeting, because I have like 4 questions. That way you can just start the next meeting responding to those questions, and we can get the clarifying questions out of the way and get to the discussion. Is that all right with everyone? Yep. Okay.
Can I make
Yes, Harvey.
Because I tried to enlarge the map. The map was low quality.
Okay.
I could not see what houses really were there. And to Ed's point that we need more community input, can we have another round of community input before we take votes next time?
Well, let's have the conversation next time to see with the task force how we feel about our readiness to move forward. And again, it's a recommendation to the council, so. But if you have questions about the presentation or the memo, please send them to staff. What's the email again? SJ?
General plan staff at sanjoseca.gov.
So not SJ, just general plan staff?
General plan staff.
At sanjoseca.gov.
sanjoseca.gov. Yep, on our website.
Nice. Thanks, everybody. Good night.